Let's do it. And now we welcome back Agent Smith.
Hey, how are you?
Solid, dude. Stream has been kicking butt.
Having fun with spicy food over there?
Yeah, just punishing myself. That's how I roll sometimes. I tend to keep pushing buttons like that where it's like, oh, maybe we'll just do a little bit more this time, and then it hurts and you have to blow your nose in the middle of a game. It's like, why do I keep doing this to myself? And I know that I'm going to make the same mistake next time. I know myself well enough to know that that's going to happen. But yeah, to update you, it's been a couple weeks since we've had a session. Sorry about that. I've been super busy and around the clock with the achievement hunt thing, which was like a ultra marathon of playing through all 3 StarCraft 2 campaigns in sequence and getting all the achievements, and we didn't sleep. We just went hard the entire way through, at least the top 4 people. And then
no problem.
And then I did a 24-hour stream last Saturday, so Sunday I was asleep. But yeah, we should be back and good to go. So, how have you been?
I've just been proofreading this week.
Oh, solid.
I'm a little rusty on that count.
How has the world been?
It's fine. There's a lot of soap opera drama in the news, but not necessarily a whole lot of substance.
Well, I haven't been super tight on what's been going on, but I heard there's more Mueller-Russia business. That's always kind of an ongoing story.
The only thing I remember about that over the past couple weeks has been Trump himself was making noises about maybe firing Mueller, and the Republican Party was pretty quick to try to discourage that. There was a lot of opposition, and there were some surprisingly staunch statements coming from the GOP in Congress on that count. So I think he pretty well wants to do it, but I don't think he has enough political support in Congress to do it without consequence. So most likely the investigation will continue on unmolested, but he's probably not happy about it. And he's probably still going to try to undermine it. That's been a pretty clear pattern thus far. It's not to say there hasn't been anything to criticize, but it's certainly been a part of the administration's strategy for dealing with it, at least in terms of containing the political cost. Yeah, I think the status quo will be there. We'll define that going forward. I don't think anything will happen to significantly disrupt the investigation, but I still don't think the investigation is really going to find anything really conclusive either. So it'll just kind of be a sideshow that runs on.
Well, and we've talked about this before with Trump's kind of persona. If he's just making noise and railing against something, then his base is often entertained and appeased by that kind of process, regardless of what the actual effect is.
Well, politics is all about show.
Yeah.
You know, it's all about seeming like you know what you're doing. Politicians rarely do, but they're very good at acting. I think there's an old saying in Washington that politics is Hollywood for ugly people. Something to that effect, and there's some truth to that. You know, politics is all about PR and appealing to your constituents' core desires, be they needs or wants. And certainly Trump has mastered that. He's very good at that. He's very good at tapping mass media in its modern form, you know, that being Twitter. And he's been criticized for watching too much cable news, but given how many people, well, certainly voters anyway, who tend to be older people, given how many older voters get their news from cable television, it actually kind of behooves them to watch a lot of cable television, including Fox News, because that kind of gives him a direct line into what his voters are thinking about, you know, how they're viewing the world. And so by kind of watching that and catering his public statements around what's discussed on cable news, he kind of gives the impression that he's closer with the voters. And that's not a bad strategy. You know, the downside is that cable news doesn't always cover things of substance, and public statements are nice, as far as building political support, but there's still the actual work of policy making, and the Trump administration still falls short there frequently. Case in point being the restrictions on immigration from certain Middle Eastern countries, Libya, Syria, etc. That would have been pretty easy if he had been quiet about it. If he had not been on Twitter saying this is explicitly a policy meant to keep out Muslims. That's illegal. You can't do that. But even if that's what he wanted to do, if he hadn't called it a Muslim ban on his tweet, it probably would have sailed through the courts pretty easily within the first couple months of his presidency. So that wasn't terribly clever. But of course, he spun that by painting the courts as biased. So he kind of came out of it with an ambiguous win, or at least not a clear loss, politically speaking. Mm-hmm. He's pretty good at that. But yeah, policymaking is not the administration's forte, and to be fair, that's something that a lot of recent administrations over the years have struggled with. The Obama administration was famous for that. Barack Obama did not have a whole lot of political experience coming into Washington. At least, I think he was a senator for a while, and then before that, he'd been in Chicago as a community organizer. So he had more than Trump does, but still not a whole lot compared to, say, somebody who's been in the system for several decades. And it showed. Barack Obama himself, and if not his administration in general, kind of struggled to build the necessary political coalitions that needed in order to push through legislation of one sort or another. And it was a pretty choppy process in the first, 4 years or so, his first term, whenever they tried to do that. They got better as it went along, but it was never really clean. And, partisanship in Washington didn't help that. But, you go to war with the army you have, not the army you want. Similarly, you go to Washington with Washington as it is, not how you want it to be. And so your ability to handle that is largely the measure by which people judge your efficacy as a leader and politician.
Mm-hmm. So there's a little kind of microcosm of politics within esports and gaming, and there's nation wars going on in the StarCraft community. So different countries have players represent them, and they're kind of battling against each other. It has more of a kind of Olympics feel to it than a lot of our standard stuff, which is just you play for the team that pays you, kind of a thing. And
gotcha.
One thing that stands out is Taiwan in this tournament is referred to as Chinese Taipei, which on other websites and everything else it always says Taiwan. So it's kind of like, what is going on here? Why is this the case? And my guess would be that it's some kind of agreement with the Chinese government and Chinese team that we'll play and we'll allow Taiwan or Chinese Taipei to play if you call us by these names. So it's like, for this tournament only, they're being referred in this certain way, where it's a little bit out of the ordinary.
That's normally the compromise that is made in business and in international organizations with regard to Taiwan. Generally, Beijing and Taipei are willing to kind of compromise in that regard, and the compromise is generally that Taiwan can participate, but they have to be called Chinese Taipei. Mm-hmm. And most people are pretty comfortable with that generally. If the Chinese government doesn't give a shit, then they're just Taiwan, and nobody cares. But when it's more high profile, or if the Chinese government takes a particular interest for whatever reason, yeah, generally Chinese Taipei is the kind of go-to compromise name. Mm-hmm. Rarely, if tensions between Beijing and Taiwan are particularly bad, the Chinese government might push for Taiwan's exclusion entirely, but that's pretty rare. Generally, they don't go that far. Taiwan is a sensitive issue for the party, the Communist Party of China, but they generally don't go out of their way to hype it like they do certain other international issues. Mm-hmm. And I would also add as a side note that in general the party isn't all that interested in international issues anyway. For them it's just a distraction. We've talked before about how the party has its hands full dealing with 1 billion plus Chinese. They don't need the headaches that come from international issues in addition to that. Mm-hmm. So for them, the status quo as far as Taiwan goes is pretty acceptable. And really it's more of a legacy issue anyway. I mean, when China was having its civil war, having a unified China was a long-running goal of Chinese nationalists. You know, they wanted to reacquire all the territory they lost to imperialist powers during the century of humiliation. And Taiwan was one of those, and so even after the Civil War ended, China became independent, the party took control. Reacquiring Taiwan was considered the final step in fulfilling that traditional nationalist goal of having a unified China. But over time, you know, there's been a generation or two that's grown up without Taiwan being explicitly a part of China, and it's not being held by an imperialist power, it's being held and controlled by Chinese. So it's not really a pressing issue per se, it's more of a, what would you call it, more of a emotive nationalist issue more than anything. Most people aren't really that moved by it anymore. So the party kind of keeps up the pressure in principle, keeps up the pretense that it really wants Taiwan back and that it's a red line for them. But it's not really so important that they're willing to go out of their way to push for it. So long as Taiwan doesn't do anything in the same vein, like push for independence explicitly or pressured the Chinese government in some way, so long as it doesn't do those things, the party will probably leave them alone. I guess the United States could come in and do something that would make the Chinese government try to put pressure on Taiwan, but even that I think would be of limited utility. I don't think Taiwan really represents a point of leverage against the United States. That's more of a point of leverage against China. You know, if the United States wanted to aggravate China or pressure them, they could, for example, send arms to Taiwan. Technically it already does that, but it's generally very low-key and it's kind of a drawn-out, difficult process. That process could be greatly simplified, and that would of course aggravate China, Beijing that is, mainland. But you know, even then they could pretty much just shrug it off. They would have to do something, but it would probably be symbolic. Again, not really that big a deal to them. So yeah, it doesn't surprise me that in this tournament you mentioned Chinese Taipei had to be used. It's just another sign of China's government being active in the foreign sphere, trying to push nationalist issues pretty much. Mostly symbolic. Again, they're more interested in domestic political considerations. Let's see. I think we had a couple questions. What direction do you feel we are headed in with North Korea? How will that affect our relationship with South Korea? Yeah, I think a couple weeks ago I would have said that probably nothing would happen with North Korea. It would probably just continue to be status quo, but the Trump administration is sending more signals, has sent more signals, in particular with the appointment of Josh Bolton as National Security Advisor, that it's seriously considering airstrikes against North Korea's nuclear program. So it's difficult to say the degree to which that's actually what they want to do and what they're going to do. It could just be posturing ahead of the upcoming talks with North Korea's government. You know, having more credibility walking into talks increases your ability to get concessions. So appointing Josh Bolton and, you know, making noise about airstrikes and that it's feasible and all that kind of thing, that could just be a part of that negotiating strategy. It may not be substantive, in other words. You know, they'll kind of prepare for it, but they don't really have plans to actually do it one way or the other. On the other hand, it could be exactly what they want to do nominally. Supposedly, Trump has made noise within the White House about wanting to do that, but again, it's hard to tell whether a leak is an actual leak or if it's a strategic leak. The Clinton administration was notorious for those. They were very clever about letting out leaks, specific kinds of leaks at specific choice times in order to have a particular political impact. So that could just be what's going on here. But the logic behind the notion of airstrikes is kind of predicated on the notion that North Korea would not really retaliate substantively. And there is some merit to that argument. Hypothetically, well, not hypothetically, North Korea is a nuclear power. They do have nuclear weapons. They don't really have the technology to do a whole lot with them, but they do have nuclear weapons. So the fear is if the United States attacks North Korea, that they would retaliate with nuclear weapons. That's pretty unlikely. North Korea is not going to win a nuclear war. You know, if the United States got into a nuclear war with Russia, there would be mutually assured destruction. There would be hundreds, if not thousands, of strategic nuclear weapons exchanged, and that would be the end of Russia and the United States. North Korea doesn't really have that capability. They could do a lot of damage, but really they would be annihilated and the United States would be hit with one or two small nuclear devices. And I don't know that the North Koreans really have powerful nuclear weapons yet. They might be more on the order of Hiroshima than on anything on the level of, say, a thermonuclear weapon, which is several orders of magnitude more powerful. So again, to kind of reiterate what we've talked about before on here, you know, the goal of the North Korean government is to stay in power. That's their principal imperative. And getting into a nuclear war with the United States does not serve that. So that's another part of this argument that the United States could launch airstrikes and kind of get away with it, so to speak. The North Koreans can't retaliate too much without risking the end of their regime either in a nuclear exchange or in a general conflict that they would not be likely to lose. You know, for the most part, the North Korean government strategy and negotiations over the past couple decades vis-a-vis its nuclear program has been to try to just look intimidating. You know, they try to imply that if they don't get their way, if anybody does anything about their nuclear program, then you know, they'll bombard Seoul and kill, you know, umpteen thousand people, or they'll use their nuclear weapons, or they'll just do something. You know, it's not even the use of nuclear weapons that's necessarily the principal problem. You know, if the North Korean government collapses, another problem would be the nuclear weapons they have falling into the black market, or the North Korean government in a sort of last act leaking the designs of their nuclear weapons to the black market, such that anybody and everybody could have access to them. That's probably a bigger problem than any nuclear attack they might launch. So just kind of seeming crazy and threatening other countries with the implosion of North Korea, that's been more their strategy. But it hasn't really worked with the Trump administration, because the Trump administration, either because it really wants to or just because it's signaling, has expressed a desire to attack North Korea directly, regardless of what North Korea might do. And so that's kind of changed the balance of the relationship. The North Korean government had, for example, traditionally asked for bilateral negotiations with the United States. And the United States had traditionally resisted that because it thought it could bring more pressure to bear in any negotiation with North Korea if there were also other partners, you know, China, Europe, etc., multilateral negotiations. And the North Koreans, of course, had long resisted that. Well, the Trump administration turned that on its head, because the Trump administration came out and said they wanted bilateral negotiations. Let's just talk directly to each other. And tellingly, the North Korean government has shied away from that. They ended up accepting the offer eventually. That was in the news a lot, too, after the Olympics. But it was kind of grudging. There was kind of a sense that they would have preferred another route, because they don't really feel, it seems, that they're going to get many concessions out of the Trump administration for obvious reasons. And that's why they kind of buttered up to the South Korean government during the Olympics. They were trying to mitigate American pressure by trying to get the South Korean government to restrain the United States. Whether or not South Korea is in a position to restrain the United States is debatable. I don't know that it's really going to help them much, but it's pretty much the only tool in their toolbox at this point. They could ask the Chinese for a security guarantee, but the Chinese would probably condition such a guarantee on the North Koreans ending their nuclear program, or at least drawing it down, in exchange for some concessions from the United States. And so there would be a hesitation on the part of the North Korean government there to really embrace the Chinese fully and the protection they could bring. You know, the North Korean government doesn't trust anybody, really. And the Chinese, for their part, aren't really happy about the North Korean government having a nuclear program. So where things kind of go from here depends on a number of factors. For one, the quality of U.S. intelligence. If the United States actually knows what targets to hit, such that it could cripple or destroy the North Korean nuclear program, that makes it more likely that there would be airstrikes. But I don't know that anybody really has that. I mean, I'm sure the North Koreans go out of their way to distribute their sites and hide them. So, and of course, North Korea is a very difficult environment for intelligence assets to operate in. So I don't know that it's really likely the United States has the necessary intelligence, which implies that it would be less likely the United States would attack, because then the United States would be incurring North Korean retaliation for basically no gain. You know, if you can't really do a lot of damage to the nuclear program, you're not really getting any benefit from the airstrikes. You're just getting the cost of whatever retaliation the North Korean government exacts. And there would certainly be some retaliation in that event. It may not be nuclear retaliation, and it probably wouldn't even be a general war. You know, I doubt the North Koreans think that they could win a war to try to reconquer South Korea. Maybe they could if they had Chinese help, but again, Chinese help probably would come with a price. And in that, I don't even know that the Chinese would be really willing to participate in an attempt to conquer South Korea. Probably Chinese support would be limited to defending against an invasion and maybe helping set up better air defenses to prevent another airstrike. But again, there would be a cost, and I don't know that North Korea would really want to pay that. But on the other hand, I could be wrong. It could be that the United States does have sufficiently good intelligence to do that, in which case it's more feasible. You know, I don't have security clearance, so I don't know. If I did, I couldn't talk about it anyway. But that's an open question. The outcome of the upcoming talks will also be important. It may be that there is an earnest desire on the part of the North Korean government to negotiate on the issue and give concessions. You know, maybe it's possible that the North Korean leader, Kim Jong-un, does not face a lot of pressure not to give concessions. It could be that his control over North Korea is sufficiently strong that he could just give up this program that the North Korean government has been defending so adamantly for so long, relatively easily, with little political blowback. On the other hand, though, it could be that the North Korean government, that palace politics, so to speak, within North Korea are such that Kim Jong-un would face a lot of blowback if he gave concessions, and so is not in a position to do that, in which case the upcoming negotiations are probably just more of a delaying tactic. Given how many times the North Korean government has used delaying tactics before in interactions with the international community, a lot of people strongly suspect that to be the case. But who's to say? It may be that there's sufficient pressure now on North Korea from all parties involved that they don't really feel they have an alternative, and that if they are going to have to give up their nuclear weapons program, they figure they might as well get something in return, which presumably they would get in a negotiation. Some kind of agreement between the United States and China is also going to be necessary. Again, China is kind of the wild card here, and they're an important wild card because how they react to this negotiation and any unilateral U.S. action is going to inform the efficacy of any such unilateral action. So it would be important for the Trump administration to communicate with Beijing and try to come to an understanding of some kind as to what's going to happen as far as North Korea and its nuclear program. It doesn't have to be a kind of, you know, Sino-American concordant as far as North Korea, but it can just be an exchange of position and red lines such that each other knows what to expect, so that each party knows what to expect from the other and isn't surprised by any given action, and in that surprise feels it necessary to escalate, perhaps escalate dangerously into a tit-for-tat that results in an outcome nobody really wants. So communication there will be important. And if China agrees that airstrikes are the only way, if North Korea is sufficiently recalcitrant that even Beijing is willing to concede that an airstrike is the only way to contain and stop the nuclear program, certainly it would almost virtually be guaranteed to go ahead at that point. And the North Korean response would probably be very limited, since they would know that Chinese support would not then be forthcoming. On the other hand, if Chinese support is more grudging, if it's more ambiguous, that mitigates things. And certainly if they're dead opposed to it, if they draw a strong line there and declare that they would back North Korea with very little in the way of conditions for that backing, that would make U.S. action significantly less likely. It would also probably result in repercussions in other areas of the Sino-American relationship, which is why I doubt they would go that far, but that is possible. It's just an example of how this is an important factor here. Political opinion in South Korea would also be important. The South Korean government, the South Korean government anyway, has kind of warmed up to the North Korean government, at least as far as the North Korean government's attempt to improve relations vis-a-vis the Olympic thaw and the subsequent warming in relations. But it could be that the South Korean population does not really allow the government to move forward in that vein. The broader South Korean population is more skeptical of the Olympic thaw, of the sort of charm offensive by North Korea, and so they may kind of that factor may limit the South Korean government's ability to kind of pursue it further. And it may be that it's just, again, a delaying tactic, in which case it doesn't go anywhere to begin with. And there are people in the South Korean government, I'm sure, who are aware of that and warn of it. But if the South Korean government is dead against airstrikes, and even among the South Korean population, which doesn't particularly trust North Korea, there is a reluctance to support airstrikes as a solution to the problem. If South Korean opinion in that vein is sufficiently against airstrikes, that would also mitigate the likelihood of the United States doing it. I'm sure if the Trump administration were really set on it, it wouldn't matter what the South Korean government or population thought. They would probably just go ahead and do it. But it is a factor to consider. It may be that the political calculus is shifted even by a relatively minor factor like that, if there were sufficient opposition. And then we already talked about palace politics in North Korea and how that could be an important factor. And then U.S. risk tolerance. If the United States government and its sundry analysts expect a strong North Korean response for whatever reason or based on whatever information they may be privy to, that obviously would make an airstrike significantly less likely. And it may be that as part of that, in order to kind of mitigate any North Korean response, the United States preemptively, before any airstrike, perhaps well before, the United States makes clear that any airstrikes would not be designed to topple the government. It would be made clear that if there were airstrikes targeting the North Korean nuclear program, they would be strictly targeted at the program itself and not in a way designed to overturn the government. Given that, again, the imperative of the North Korean government is to stay in power, and facing airstrikes, if they experienced American airstrikes, they may fear that that power would be in jeopardy and would feel necessary to retaliate more strongly than they would otherwise. Given that fact, an American guarantee that any such strikes would be strictly focused on the nuclear program would serve to kind of calm their nerves in that regard and would give them a third option beyond heavy retaliation or no retaliation. It would give them the option of kind of backing out slowly, giving some light retaliation, and then leaving it at that, which would kind of preclude the tit-for-tat escalatory spiral that could result in an unwanted conflict. So that's kind of a rundown of the important factors, and a lot of those are very uncertain, so it's kind of hard to determine what will happen. It's kind of hard to say on what track we're on as far as that goes. I'd say we're more strongly on the track of airstrikes and unilateral action than we were before, say, a month ago. But I still think in general it's relatively unlikely. I think all of the players involved are pretty clear as far as what they want and as far as how far they're willing to go. And I think the North Korean government would, in the event that American airstrikes were perceived to be likely, would probably then back down. I don't think they're strongly interested in a general conflict, and they'll probably negotiate at some point. Maybe not in the upcoming Trump-Kim negotiations, but if not in those negotiations, then probably not long after. Their position is kind of eroding with time. And as the Trump administration gives out stronger and stronger signals that it wants a unilateral solution, it behooves the North Korean government more and more to give some kind of concessions as far as the nuclear program. And they might ask for something in return. I don't know what the United States would be willing to give up. I doubt they're going to evacuate the peninsula, or I think one idea that I read somewhere was that the United States might be asked to remove its nuclear guarantee from South Korea, implying that the United States would not be willing to defend South Korea with nuclear weapons. Even in the case of North Korea not having nuclear weapons. In other words, if North Korea gave up its nuclear weapons, they would want the United States to not use nuclear weapons if a war were to break out on the peninsula. I don't think that's particularly likely. I think the United States would probably prefer to have that as a last-ditch option and would consider it a matter of sovereignty when and where it uses its nuclear weapons. But it might also be that the United States government agrees to it, knowing that it could just break the agreement on a whim. If a war actually did break out, they could very easily just use them anyway, and there wouldn't be a lot of recourse for Pyongyang in that case. So it could be an empty promise that kind of allows the North Korean government to save face and move forward with disarmament.
One overlapping principle between StarCraft play and the way that North Korea behaves is that if you have a much weaker force than the enemy, it behooves you to aggressively posture and try to bluff that you're actually really strong and dangerous and they shouldn't mess with you. And that's a very standard kind of approach of, uh-oh, I'm behind, so I need to really appear that I'm very strong so they'll be hesitant to attack me, even if they may be way ahead and I know that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's very much been the That's very much been North Korea's foreign policy for the past couple decades, especially after the Soviet Union collapsed and they lost one of their principal sources of support. Their strategy worked a lot better when their counterparties, generally the U.S. administration or South Korea's administration, were more risk-averse. There was a sense that there was a desire to restrict North Korea's ambitions as far as its nuclear program, but there was a lot of reluctance to really commit too hard on it for fear of sparking a regime collapse, which would be very bad for China, which is why the Chinese government in general has been more supportive of North Korea. They don't want a flood of North Korean refugees flooding over the border. And then for the American example, the United States didn't want to cause a war, which it would be committed to fighting. So there was general reluctance on the part of surrounding powers to really pressure North Korea too much, which made their strategy of bluffing more effective. In general, they could kind of puff themselves up, and other players would generally not believe that they would really do anything, but went the route of caution anyway, just to be safe. The bluffing approach doesn't work as well with the Trump administration, which is more aggressive, shall we say, has been more forceful on the issue, which has led to North Korea kind of taking these other alternative strategies that they hadn't used before, like buttering up to South Korea, talking more with China, etc. Again, without knowing more definitively what these various variables that I talked about were, I would find it difficult certainly for myself, if not anyone, to really give a clear-cut prediction as to what's going to happen going forward. But yeah, that's a very good example of North Korea's position, their approach, their traditional approach. And then the second part of the question, that's a long-winded answer to the first part of the question. The second part of the question was, how will that affect our relationship with South Korea? I assume our means the United States. The South Korea really can't pressure the United States too much. The South Korean government can't stop the United States from launching unilateral airstrikes. They might be able to stop them, if only legally, from using South Korean bases, launching airstrikes from South Korea. But beyond that, there's pretty limited pressure they can bring to bear, because they could, the United States could just as easily launch airstrikes from a carrier or from Okinawa or what have you. There's also the issue of the economic relationship between South Korea and the United States. The Trump administration has been putting more pressure on other nations, friend and foe alike, as far as trade relationships. And so the South Korean government might be more reluctant to go against the Trump administration on the North Korean issue if they think it could cost them in terms of the economic relationship. I don't know how serious the Trump administration really is about renegotiating trade relationships, because a lot of what they've done thus far has kind of been more thunder than substance, kind of smoke and mirrors rather than tangible action and tangible gains. But nominally, that is a threat, there is a concern there, and that could deter them from putting whatever pressure they might have on the United States. And given how reliant the South Korean government and South Korea generally is on the U.S. security umbrella to protect it against not just North Korea but also China, and also for the economic relationship with the United States to serve as a counterbalance against China. Given South Korea's dependencies in those regards, the cost benefit is not really in favor of them kind of breaking the relationship. I don't think that they trust the Chinese government enough to really just abandon the relationship with the United States and embrace China and come to some kind of understanding there that would create a new status quo in the region. I think there's still a lot of distrust of the Communist Party of China. No surprise. And as a result, there's kind of a reluctance to move too far away from the United States, even if the United States kind of moves in a direction they don't like. So I don't think whatever happens will have too much impact in that regard. Some people, if the United States really goes full-bore unilateral action on North Korea, the South Korean government would be very upset, and they would tell everybody that they were very upset, and that would probably be the end of it. There wouldn't be a whole lot else that they could do, or at least that they would want to do. Oh, by the way, is the sound okay this time?
Sound is much better. There hasn't been any inconsistency.
I haven't done anything different, so I don't know why.
The problem just went away. The hardest problems to solve.
Let's see. Are the recent sanctions, in the literal and inferred sense of the word, against Russia and China a realization that capitalism needs to change things up? I don't think so. Well, there aren't any sanctions against China. There are just tariffs. These are just punitive tariffs for steel dumping and I think dumping in washing machines, I think was the earlier one. I think people kind of forgot about that. And then there was the more recent one was the $50 billion in tariffs targeting. Well, actually, it's not really clear what they're targeting. I think they're still drawing those up. But nominally, they're punishment for intellectual property violations as well as sundry non-tariff trade barriers in the Chinese market, of which there are quite a few. So there's punitive tariffs in that regard, but there are no actual sanctions. There is no punishment. There is no legal punishment for firms that do business with China. So there are no sanctions in that regard. There are certainly sanctions against Russia, but they're still relatively limited. I don't really think there's any sanctions that target Russia broadly. Like, you can still do business in Russia. I think the sanctions target specific entities within Russia, specific individuals and specific businesses. But if a given individual or business is not on the sanctions list, I think technically in the United States, as well as in most of Europe, you can still kind of just go into Russia and sell stuff. I think that's the case. I think there might be one or two specific items that might have a universal ban, but I can't remember off the top of my head what they would be. I know that the Russian government imposed sanctions on Europe, barring the import of food, European Union foodstuffs. So that's kind of a broad ban, but that's not that was not imposed on Russia. That was imposed by Russia on another actor. But the question, regardless, is the recent sanctions and, I presume, tariffs against China. Oh, that's why you wrote in the literal and inferred sense of the word. Okay, fair point. So what do these things mean for? Do these things mean that capitalism needs to change things up? The question's a little bit ambiguous. I'm not sure if you mean, does capitalism need to change, or does the United States, among other actors, need to change the current status quo, the current free market status quo? I don't know that there's a lot you can do about capitalism. That's kind of just what it is. As far as changing the status quo, there is room for debate there, because there's a lot of people who are arguing, certainly the Trump administration is arguing, that there should be more punishments for governments that do not sort of adhere to the free trade regime in a fair way. There's a sense that there's a lot of unfair trade practices going on that are not really being sufficiently addressed and punished, and that there should be more deterrence to prevent these actions and to prevent countries from deriving unfair competitive advantage from them. So certainly there's an argument to be had there, but I don't know that recent sanctions, broadly defined, as you say, are an example of how they need, are an example that they need to change. to really kind of take a broad, what's the word I want? Not ambiguous. Abstract. Kind of take a broad abstract view of the question. I would say yes, that the sanctions do reflect the fact that there are inequities in the current status quo world trade regime, and that there are issues that should be addressed. And these issues have kind of long been recognized, even amongst pro-trade people, pro-trade entities like corporations, think tanks, what have you. There's just been limited will to kind of address it, and even when there's been will, there's been a limited ability to kind of really sort of create a sufficiently strong coalition to deal with it. Part of the problem is that China's market is so large that a lot of actors are not willing to kind of risk their economic relationship with China in order to put pressure on them. And a lot of countries individually do not have enough leverage in their relationship with China to kind of win that battle. If they put pressure on China, China would put pressure on them in return. And given how much more leverage China has, they would win that battle. So in order to really leverage a country like China, well, there is no country like China. So in order to leverage China, which is kind of the principal problem child in this regard, not to rag on China. Certainly there are other actors who do that in varying degrees, but none of them are as large and powerful and impactful as China. So China is generally kind of what the conversation in this regard inevitably gravitates to. So if you want to leverage China and pressure them to improve their trade practices such that they are more fair and equitable, you would need a multilateral coalition of nations to do that, because no one nation, not even really the United States, has enough leverage with China to really force them to change policy in that regard. You would need a lot of different nations, a lot of China's trade partners to kind of band together and all at once as a bloc try to apply that pressure on them. And thus far, that's not happening. And in fact, the opposite has been happening. The trend has very much been towards more bilateral relationships rather than multilateral relationships. And again, China has the advantage in bilateral relationships, so I don't see much changing in that regard going forward. Russia doesn't really participate a whole lot in international trade, so they don't have much of an impact there as far as any inequities in the free trade regime. Certainly they abuse their market power in gas markets. They try to use that. The Russian government, I should say, uses its relationship with Gazprom to apply pressure strategically and selectively against certain governments over certain issues in order to gain leverage. But that's kind of a mixed bag. Most of the pressure they can bring to bear is against poorer countries who are not as economically developed. They sell a lot more gas to Germany than they do to, say, the Balkans nations, which is more where they do this. But the thing about that is that Russia makes a lot of money off of the trade with Germany. You can put sanctions on a country to punish them, but the more trade you do with them, the more disruptive those sanctions are going to be to you, as well as the counterparty. So it's always a double-edged sword. So as much as Europe wants to buy Russia's gas, Russia needs to sell it even more, because the money the Russian government makes from selling the gas is much more important to the Russian economy, and especially Russian government revenues, than it is relative to the gain to European economies, as large gain as that might be. So that's why Russia also prefers bilateral relationships, because they can leverage their advantage more strongly against the smaller, less developed nations that are more dependent on cheap, subsidized Russian gas. They can't really do that with the Germanys of the world, because Germany has probably more leverage in the relationship, given how much money Russia makes off of the trade with them. So it's, I guess I would ask for some elaboration on the question, because I'm a little unsure about exactly what you're going for. And maybe I'm missing something really obvious. That wouldn't surprise me. I'm not. I can be a little scatterbrained sometimes, so that's definitely quite possible. I apologize if that's the case. I'll add here the usual disclaimer I make every week. I'm not an expert in a lot of the things we talk about. I'm somewhat knowledgeable in certain areas, but in some areas I'm more of a amateur. I'm more new. I read about it in the news, maybe some think tank reports, and I might have some connection to it from my grad school days. But there are some issues for which I don't have a strong foundation. I really wouldn't call myself an expert in anything. And so I wouldn't go so far as to say that you should just listen to me and take whatever I say at face, as being inherently true. I welcome criticism and feedback. One of the things I like about coming on here with Neuro is that I get a lot of feedback from people in chat, and I learn a lot reading chat. I don't read it while we do this, but I'll read it after the fact, and I find it very enlightening. I would definitely encourage people to call me out on anything I get wrong or anything I say that's stupid or what have you. So feedback definitely encouraged in that regard. Let's see. So I'm sorry I can't quite get to the crux of the question here. I suspect I'm missing the point of it, and I apologize again. Please do elaborate, and we can, if you want, anyway, if you feel like it, elaborate, and we can kind of come back to it. Let's see. What happened with the Russian spy poison thing in the UK? What happened with it? What happened with it? Well, I guess I could interpret that two ways. What is the story there, or what has happened subsequent to the story? I assume you mean what happened after the assassination attempt. I guess for anybody not familiar with this, there was a former spy. He was Russian, but he worked for the British as a spy for them, as an informant, I guess, for them. And the Russians found out about it, sent him to prison, and he ended up in Britain after a spy swap. Basically, the British swapped some Russian spies for this guy, as well as some other British spies in Russia. And this was a long time ago. I think this was back in the 90s or early aughts. I suspect he probably needed the money. There's a lot of people in Russia at the time who were not getting paid their regular salary on time, and so it may have been more that, but that's speculation on my part. Regardless, he ended up in the UK, and then a couple weeks ago, he and his daughter were found basically dying on a bench in a mall, and it turned out that it was a nerve. They had been subjected, or exposed rather, to a nerve agent, and nobody quite knows who's responsible for that. The suspicion is that the Russian government was somehow involved. Nobody really quite knows how, though. That's kind of the problem. Some have speculated that the Putin government is trying to send a message to traitors that betraying your country has consequences, and that it doesn't matter where you go or how far away you may be, that eventually you'll get yours. You'll be punished for it. I'm not entirely sold on that. I don't know that the Putin government is really that petty. Normally, spy swaps result in people being pretty safe. It's kind of a norm in intelligence circles, between nations rather, that you don't go after and assassinate people in the other's country. Sometimes it's happened, but never really before with people who had been part of the spy swap. Those people are generally considered to be off, hands off. And I don't think the Russian government would really benefit a whole lot from doing this. I think it would seem, if they did, like it would be more of an emotive thing, that they were more attracted to it just in principle, more than any specific goal. But normally the Russian government is very particular, very targeted about taking such actions. And so this doesn't really feel like their style. It could be Kadyrov again. A lot of the high-profile assassinations in Russia tend to be perpetrated by Chechens, who then are arrested and receive terms, but it's never really determined who put them up to it, who kind of paid for it, who organized the assassination attempt in question. And the suspicion is that a lot of those cases are actually organized by the president of Chechnya down in southern Russia. Nominally, Chechnya is a part of Russia, but sort of in exchange for recognizing Russian control of the province, the Russian government has given de facto control of the province to an autonomous government there, who has under the control of Kadyrov, who has much more power than any other such autonomous province in Russia. It's basically his own personal little kingdom. And the suspicion is that, kind of to show loyalty to the government, and Putin in particular, Kadyrov has been periodically assassinating critics of the government and sundry such people. And it may be that he and his team are kind of responsible for this assassination, possibly also the Litvinenko assassination. Although this definitely isn't really the Kadyrov style. Generally assassinations that are associated with the Chechens are pretty cut and dry, shoot you in the face and then leave. They're not really complex attacks. They don't generally involve nerve agents or polonium. But it's possible anyway. And it may be that they used a nerve agent in this case, possibly polonium in the Litvinenko case, because they were targeting someone in another country and didn't want to leave as much of a trail. That's possible. It could also be that it didn't have anything to do with the Russian government or the Chechen government. It could have just been an individual effort. The problem there is that, how did they? The problem there is it raises the question of how they got a hold of the nerve agent. And if you can get nerve agents on the black market, that's a big problem for everybody, not just people who are on the bad side of the Russian government. So there's a big question as to how that's possible. The suspicion is that it's really not possible, that you can't get nerve agent on the black market, and that it happened with the complicity of the Russian government. The thinking goes that either the Russian government was explicitly involved in the transfer of the nerve agent, or that protections in Russia regarding nerve agents are so weak that it's easy to smuggle them out. In which case, the Russian government is not really guilty of being involved in the assassination, but is guilty of negligence. And so kind of facilitating the assassination through negligence in that regard. I think I read a tabloid report, tabloids are not great sources, but sometimes they actually do a lot more of the on-the-ground investigating that a lot of major newspapers don't do anymore. So every so often a tabloid comes up with a big story that other papers miss because they don't actually have reporters talking to people. So as a possibility, I pose that this tabloid report suggested that it was actually this guy's it was the daughter who was the actual target. The idea being that the story was that her daughter was marrying someone, a man whose mother did not approve of the marriage. And apparently her prospective mother-in-law had ties with Russia's intelligence apparatus. And it could be that this woman did not want her son to marry the daughter of a traitor, and so used her ties to get a hold of some nerve agent, and then either herself or in cahoots with some other group organized an assassination attempt using the nerve agent. I haven't heard anything about that story beyond the tabloids, though, so I don't know how much substance there is to it. Probably nothing, but it's possible, and it at least makes sense. It makes more sense than the Russian government doing it, just sort of arbitrarily assassinating a random guy. Hypothetically, it makes sense that they would target a traitor to the country, but there's no shortage of Russian traitors. There were a number of people who have been acquired, who have moved over to Britain and other countries in spy swaps, and none of them have been targeted. So why this guy? What's special about Skripal? And for that matter, why also target his daughter? Why also target Yulia? I think the assumption a lot of people make is that Yulia was kind of collateral damage, and that Skripal was the main target. But who's to say? I don't know enough about nerve agents to know how easy it is to target a specific person without collateral damage, so I'm not sure about it. I can't really speak to that, but it could be that it really was Yulia who was the principal target. Maybe it was collateral damage, or maybe not. I guess the point I'm trying to make here is that there are a lot of ambiguities in the story. It's not really clear the extent to which Russia was really involved. But then that begs the question of, if you can't really ascertain Russian guilt, why then has the UK response been so strong? And why has there been a lot more solidarity than had been expected from allied nations? And I think the issue there is precedent. For the British government, they don't really know who did it, but it's possible the Russian government did it. And if they did do it, and they got away with it, that sets a precedent that would be very problematic for the British government, if not also other government, which is that you can just go and assassinate people whenever you want and get away with it. And the British don't want to encourage that, so just in case, they've imposed sanctions, and well, not even imposed sanctions, they've expelled diplomats, among other minor acts. Basically, they've punished Russia, broadly speaking, just in case, because the cost of allowing the precedent to go forward unchallenged, even if maybe there is no even if maybe it really wasn't Russia, the cost of allowing the precedent to be set is much higher than a false positive. Whatever damage they may be doing to their relations with Russia, which really haven't been much, since they haven't actually done much to punish Russia, but whatever punishment they might bring on Russia and whatever retaliation that might bring is not as costly for the British, at least in the opinion of London, than would be the setting of this precedent that would kind of facilitate more assassinations in Britain. And so it's kind of a probabilistic thing. And this is a difficult problem a lot of states have. There are a lot of examples of problems that states have to deal with where they're not really sure where responsibility lies or what course of action would be most effective. And in those cases, you kind of have to make a judgment call. And the problem with judgment calls like that is that they're not always very compelling. They very much lend themselves to criticism, because it doesn't really look from the outside like the government is being fully forward about it. Like when the British government comes out and says, we're pretty sure it was the Russian government and we're going to punish them accordingly. You know, it's easy to pick holes in that argument, because obviously, you know, like I've said, and like a lot of people have shown, there's a lot of holes in that argument, in the argument that Russia was behind it. But if you look at it from the perspective of the government, which is that we really don't know for sure, but this is a big problem if it was, and just to be safe, we should do something, it makes a lot more sense. I'll add here, though, that, again, they haven't really done a lot. I mean, there's been a huge media circus about, you know, all the action that's been taken against Russia, and all they've done is expel diplomats, and that's basically the diplomatic equivalent of cheap talk. It's not really a substantive move. It's basically what you do when you're pissed off but don't really want to do anything too substantive to jeopardize the relationship. And the Russian government has already come out and said, a lot of the nations that have expelled diplomats have said, yeah, we expelled some diplomats, but you know, we didn't really particularly want to. We more just did it for show, just kind of out of solidarity with Britain. But we don't really want to jeopardize the relationship too much, so don't take it too personally. The Russian government has asserted that that's been the case with a lot of nations, especially some of the smaller ones. And it wouldn't surprise me if that were actually the case. Obviously, part of your job as diplomat is to kind of bullshit a bit. So certainly the Russians have a reputation for talking big, but I think they're being at least a little bit, I think there is some truth to that assessment. There are probably a lot of countries that are concerned by what happened in London and do want to express solidarity with the British, and who probably do think the Russians are probably guilty, or at least strongly suspect that to be true, but who also don't want to upset economic relations with the Russians too much, or at least more so than have already been done by pre-existing sanctions over the Ukraine. So that's kind of where the Skripal story and the Russian spy poison thing is at. And you know, I hope that kind of I hope that's the answer this person was looking for. That's kind of a rambling answer, kind of all over the place, but that's what I remember anyway. That's kind of where it's been.
Rambling is something that we do very well here.
Yeah, rambling and meandering.
We just got a host from Juggernaut. Jason, welcome. Everyone who joined here and doesn't have any context, we're talking about stuff that happens in the world. This is world discussion time. So that's why I'm silent. This is not a podcast being played. This is a real person. If you put questions in the chat, those can be handed along to him if they're appropriate to his area of expertise. Hope you enjoy the broadcast, Jason. I hope you had a great stream. Welcome, everyone.
Yeah, hello. Excuse me. So the next question was, can you give us a brief explanation of the creation of Taiwan and why China doesn't acknowledge Taiwan as an independent country? Oh, that's a technical question. These are always fun. Yeah, these are a little more direct than some of the more sort of ambiguous, abstract questions about the nature of the universe and some of those we've gotten. Mm-hmm. Yeah, a brief explanation of the creation of Taiwan. So Taiwan's independence, such as it is, stems from the Chinese Civil War, and you know, I won't go too much into the Chinese Civil War unless somebody wants me to. But basically, there was a big war after World War II between the communists and between the nationalists. The nationalists being unified under the Kuomintang, which is Mandarin for nationalist. And so the Kuomintang were led by the famous Chiang Kai-shek, and he was not very popular after World War II. By the end of World War II, the Kuomintang had pretty thoroughly discredited themselves. They had performed pretty poorly fighting against the Japanese, and in fact, they'd already been unpopular even before the Second Sino-Japanese War broke out, which is what they call sort of World War II in China, or at least China's involvement with it. He'd already been unpopular because he had allowed a lot of Japanese aggression against China to go unpunished. And so people were already pretty impatient with the Kuomintang, and especially Chiang Kai-shek in particular, because there was a sense that the government was not really doing anything to protect the nation. In fairness to Chiang Kai-shek, the reason that that was happening was because he didn't think that China, and specifically China's military, was ready to go toe-to-toe with Japan, and he was pretty much right. You know, performance in the war kind of bore that out. But they did the best they could, but it just did not engender a lot of support amongst the population. There was also a lot of economic mismanagement during the war. There was, you know, hyperinflation and a lot of rationing and a significant amount of corruption. A lot of the aid sent to China ended up in the hands of a few individuals, and I think I think the guy who led China's Ministry of Finance during that period, I don't recall his name, and I might even be getting the ministry wrong, but I think he ended up being one of the wealthiest people in the world after the war, because he'd stolen so much money from, you know, not just government revenues, but also from foreign aid. And the Kuomintang were also known for being pretty brutal. There was a lot of conscription, and training was not particularly great. Officers pretty routinely stole money from their men, didn't pay them, so corruption was a big problem. And one of the biggest problems the Kuomintang had is that it was very decentralized. The Kuomintang had getting further and further back in history, but the Kuomintang had started out as sort of a nationalist organization that intended to unify China and bring stability and modernity to China. The trouble they faced was the warlords. China, after 1911, when it became a republic, broke into basically a series of statelets, a series of warring warlords. That sounds a bit repetitive, but a bunch of warlords ruled China in what was called the warlords period after 1918 or so, when the republic collapsed. And the Kuomintang sort of dedicated themselves to sort of defeating these people and trying to create a unified nationalist government. They were never able to really do that because the Kuomintang were never sufficiently powerful to defeat all of the warlords. So what they did instead is they allied with some of the warlords against some of the other ones. And that became the basis of the government going forward. There was sort of a balance of power between the Kuomintang central leadership and the Kuomintang military forces, or at least the forces in the Chinese military loyal to the Kuomintang. A balance of power between them and the warlords that they had allied with. And sometimes when relations got tense, some of those warlords threatened to break away or have a conflict with the Kuomintang. And they had enough power for that to be a credible threat, and to credibly threaten the unity of the Chinese, basically China, to threaten the unity of China. And so the Kuomintang, in order to try to continue pushing economic development and to continue building political institutions, generally catered to some of the demands of these warlords. They couldn't get away with whatever they wanted. The Kuomintang had sufficient power and pressure relative to the warlords to kind of strong-arm them pretty frequently, but they couldn't force them to do whatever they wanted. And they had enough power to kind of maintain a fair amount of autonomy. And the trouble with that arrangement is that the warlords were immensely unpopular with the Chinese population. And there was a sense that the Kuomintang, by compromising with these people, was compromising the dream of a unified modern China, that they were kind of making a deal with the devil that wasn't worth the while, so to speak. And so the Kuomintang became immensely unpopular. The Civil War broke out after the war. There was some effort to stop it from happening, but it was pretty much inevitable. In fact, the Kuomintang had basically been at war with the communists since the, I want to say, early 30s, maybe even earlier than that. There had been truces during the war, but even, you know, a lot of those, it was pretty common for those truces to be violated. So, you know, World War II in China often looked like a three-way war between the Japanese, the Kuomintang, and the communists. But that's, again, a whole nother conversation. You know, we can get into that later if somebody wants to, but the point here is that the Civil War was pretty one-sided. Most of the population was pretty clearly supportive of the communists, or at the very least, if they didn't support the communists, was pretty against the Kuomintang. And without public support, the Kuomintang struggled to field a strong military. And China's economy was not in great shape after the war anyway, so they were also stretched for funds. And the result was that the communists pretty much swept, after the first year anyway. There was some fighting, tough fighting in the first year or so, but my understanding is that after the first year or so, the communists swept south and pretty much just, you know, steamrolled the Kuomintang from China. And the communists pretty well started from their stronghold in, what was it, Shanxi, I think, Shanxi, in northern China, and pushed east into Manchuria and then south. And so as the Guomindang were pushed south, they were pushed into the coast of China, the southeastern coast. And as it became apparent they would not be able to hold the line in mainland China, the Guomindang evacuated from the coast, southeastern coast of China to nearby Taiwan, hoping that they could use that as a kind of fortress and then eventually build up enough power to try to reconquer China, to invade it later. As was, the communists tried to follow them across the strait into Taiwan, but the United States intervened at that point and made it clear that any further communist aggression against the Guomindang government in Formosa, as it was then called, now called Taiwan, any further communist aggression in Taiwan would be met with American intervention. So basically the United States intervened in the Chinese Civil War before it could fully finish, with the result that the Guomindang, even though they'd thoroughly lost the war, were still able to survive on the one tiny bit of territory they'd been able to retain on this island called Taiwan. So Taiwan pretty much owes its independence to the United States. Probably the communists would have been able to take it eventually if the United States had not made a security guarantee at that point. The result has been a somewhat awkward equilibrium in the region because the communists assert that, again, it's a nationalist emotive issue in China. Taiwan is a part of China, and right now it's only kind of separated because of American foreign intervention. The Guomindang in China, or no, let me rephrase, the Chinese in Taiwan, of course, feel differently. They don't want to be they don't want to be ruled by communists. But there has been some sentiment that even if they don't want to be ruled by communists, they do want to reunify with China at some point because they are all not Chinese, and they are all Chinese nationalists. The Guomindang, again, was the nationalist party. So the Guomindang in particular, after the Civil War, even after it became very clear they were never going to be able to reconquer the mainland, still held out hope and that it would reunify at some point with the mainland under Guomindang control, or perhaps at least under some kind of democratic arrangement. That was official Guomindang policy in Taiwan for a long time. I'll point out here that the Guomindang ruled Taiwan the same way they ruled China, which is to say in a very authoritarian fashion. It was very much a one-party state for a long time. But over time, people in Taiwan have kind of mellowed a bit. There's a whole generation of Taiwanese now who have grown up with Taiwan being separate from the mainland and who have no memory of the mainland. For a long time after the Civil War, most of the population of Taiwan were emigres. They were people who had traveled from the mainland out because of the Civil War to try to escape the communists. And so they all remembered the mainland, came from the mainland, and wanted to return someday. And so they had a strong sentimental attachment to the mainland and supported the Guomindang line that they should try to reunify at some point. But the younger generation, I should say, are not that wedded to the notion of reunification, and they really feel that Taiwan is pretty independent, and they really don't want to be a part of China. Or at least I should say they don't want to be a part of a communist China. I think the communist bit is more important than the China bit. I think there is a sentimental attachment to mainland Chinese as fellow Chinese, but they fear communist rule and don't really want that very much. And so that's empowered independent people who are pro-independence on the island. And that's pretty much the constituency for the DPP, which is the big opposition party in Taiwan. The Guomindang allowed democratization to move forward, I want to say in the 90s, early 90s, something around there. And the DPP was the principal opposition party to emerge, and they were explicitly pro-independence. Whereas the Guomindang, as it's always been, has pretty much always been for reunification. They don't want strict independence because they want to be part of China at some point in the future. Probably not a communist China, but in principle they want reunification. So let me see. That's pretty much it. That's pretty much a brief explanation of the creation of Taiwan, and I think that pretty well covers why China doesn't acknowledge them as independent. And I guess I talked a little bit about that before. It's just sort of an emotive nationalist issue left over from that period when, from the Civil War period and from the tail end of the century of humiliation.
That's the most I can say without not being brief.
Yeah.
I hit my word limit.
Yeah. I think there was some trivia I remembered. That slipped my mind. One ear in one ear, out the other. It was relevant too. Whatever, maybe it'll come to me later. Anyway, what do you think about Trump bringing home troops from Syria and setting up a meeting with the North Korean president? Well, we covered North Korea. He hasn't really brought troops home from Syria yet. He said that he would. But the Trump administration says a lot of things, so I don't know whether or not that's actually going to happen. And he's kind of waffled on Syria several times already. You know, he said before he didn't want to, when he was running for president and early in his presidency, he said he didn't really want to do foreign interventions and a lot of wars overseas. But then after a while, he started to double down on them. You know, he doubled down on Afghanistan, and he ended up increasing support to the Kurds in Syria and fighting, you know, empowering the military basically to fight more against the Islamic State in Syria. And then after that, he was a little ambiguous about what he wanted to do after the Islamic State was gone. You know, how much of a presence should the United States have, etc. And then in January or so, he came out pretty strongly, or at least it seemed so at the time. He came out pretty strongly for a strong presence in Kurdish territory in Syria in order to prevent the return of Islamic State and to try to build up the local institutions and local economy to try to make the place less attractive to radicals, radical extremists of one sort or another, principally jihadis. And so at that point, it seemed like the United States would have a long-term commitment and presence in SDF-controlled territory in the eastern half of Syria. And it, you know, my impression was that was going to happen up until the past week or two, when Trump himself kind of came out and said that he would pull troops out of Syria. And that would be a pretty significant change in American policy in the region. I'm sure any number of local allies are probably very concerned by that. One of the reasons the United States has kind of committed more to the region, and I suspect had committed more to Syria in particular, was because of pressure from the Saudis, who have long wanted the United States to have a stronger presence in the region and to put more pressure not only on Iran, but also Iranian allies like Syria, like the Syrian government. And I suspect there's also been a lot of pressure to deepen involvement by certain people in the national security apparatus. There's a lot of people who have experience with Iraq, for example, in the national security apparatus, and there's long been a sense among those people that the United States should have stayed in Iraq longer in order to help prevent the return of in order to prevent an upsurge in the insurgency, an upsurge in the rebel groups, which of course later manifested as the Islamic State and seized a lot of territory. There was a sense that there should have been a stronger, a presence at all of the American military in Iraq to try to prevent that, or at least make it less likely. You can kind of quibble with that. There's kind of a debate about whether or not it would have happened anyway, whether the U.S. was there or not, but probably they wouldn't have taken nearly as much territory if the United States had presence in Iraq at the time. Regardless, that's kind of a whole other conversation. The point is there are people in the administration with national security experience who probably lobbied the president to have a stronger American presence in Kurdish territory. So that combined with Saudi lobbying probably resulted in that policy where the United States had that presence. And I imagine that after Trump made the statement that troops would be removed, that there was a lot more lobbying behind the scenes for him to walk back on that, which is why I'm a bit skeptical that there's actually going to be a change here. I don't, if I had to make a prediction, I don't think troops will actually leave Syria. I suspect that there's going to be a sufficient pressure brought by, the relevant groups that I mentioned that he'll change his mind on that. And it would seem that the president changes his mind pretty frequently depending on who he talks to. That's kind of a rumor that may or may not be true, but he seems to whipsaw around in terms of his policy preferences and policy decisions a lot. I don't think that much is disputable. So I suspect this will be another example of that. I don't think there will be a clear statement, I've changed my mind again. It'll just be implicit. Probably nothing will happen. It'll just kind of go quiet on the issue for a while until it sort of flares up again at some point for some reason. But my suspicion is that nothing substantive will come of that. If they did do that, if American troops were brought back from Syria, if the statement is credible and there is follow through, That would sort of unbalance the equilibrium in Syria right now. Things have kind of been trending towards a relatively stable equilibrium in Syria since the Islamic State collapsed. It's it has not been completely defeated, but it's almost there. But since then, since the Islamic State has pretty much been defeated, things have been trending towards a stable equilibrium, and the equilibrium had kind of been predicated on an American presence in eastern Syria. Without that presence, all of the actors in the region pretty much can all kind of unify behind their common enemy, which is the Kurds. So there could be some kind of Turkish, Syrian, Russian understanding, détente, if you will, created around, engineered around common cooperation against Kurdish interests in eastern Syria. And that could then be traded by sundry relevant actors in exchange for recognition of the Turkish sphere of influence in northern Syria, an end to rebel operations against the government, active attempts to overthrow the government, some kind of recognition of an Iranian presence in Syria, etc. So there's a lot of things that can be negotiated there. But kind of cooperating against the Kurds could serve as sort of the common good, so to speak, the common frame of reference around which other negotiations could center. With the United States there, they couldn't do that, and so the negotiations were much more between sort of the Saudi-American axis and the Russian-Syrian axis. That was sort of the more important the set of negotiations. Turkey was more of an outlier in that case. And probably if the United States does stay in Syria, again, I think they will, then I suspect that Syria and the SDF will come to some kind of arrangement that excludes Turkey, or at least brings a lot of pressure to bear on Turkey to try to kind of push them out, or at least mitigate their influence. But again, if the United States leaves, then that whole equilibrium changes, and you end up with more of a sort of Turco-Syrian compact of some kind. Off the top of my head,
people.
Yeah, yeah, those poor hill people.
Remember, don't we dislike hill people? And we want to keep them in the hills. They can't expand.
Yeah, yeah. If an ethnic group or a population lives in hills, it's generally not because they wanted to. It's generally because they used to live in some of the more fertile areas under the hills and were pushed into the hills by a hostile invasion of some kind, or perhaps long process of migration, one or the other. And so as a result, hill people tend to be somewhat maligned because of tension stemming from that original invasion. And the Kurds are an example of that. They live in very mountainous areas of, well, several countries, but mountainous areas of the Middle East generally, let's say. I think they're in a couple flat areas still, but not very many. I think the Arabs and Turks have largely pushed them out of that over the past few centuries.
Yeah, so one point of discussion, we've talked about this a little bit before, is the effort toward impartiality. We're American, we were born and raised, we're U.S. nationals, and the viewership is international, so there are people from the outside of the U.S. with different perspectives than we have. One thing that is a general theme is that we try to point out what's being done wrong, what's being done right, but as we're talking about stuff, it depends on the situation, and a lot of it is more complex than you would think from the outset. Additionally, if you have information that we don't, or we're saying something that is factually incorrect, please correct us. We try to be as unbiased as possible, but everyone has a bias. The key thing is identifying what that is and how that impacts your presentation and so forth and so on.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, that's a good summary.
A lot of people, they see Americans talking about politics and they're very rustled about the expansionist military-industrial complex of the U.S. And it's like, well, aren't you ruining other people's stuff? Yeah, we've made a lot of mistakes. Neither of us are in the military. We're kind of the armchair, let's talk about what's happening in the world. But neither of us are engaged in any of those systems. We're just citizens of the country. And I was talking about this a couple days ago. The average person of a given country is basically a moderate of that country. They're kind of a centrist. They're not super committed to either of the extremes. They're in the middle, kind of trying to observe what's going around and be a citizen.
Yeah. Yeah, when I talk about American foreign policy, I'm not making judgments. I'm not saying that the United States should be in Syria or should not be in Syria or what have you. I'm just trying to describe what the circumstances are, what the situation is, what the negotiations look like, etc. What you do with that knowledge is up to you. You can oppose or support America's presence however you like. I'm not going to tell you what to believe in. You know, I leave everybody to make their own judgments. You know, I try to present unbiased information so that people can kind of inform themselves and better inform their own conclusions. But in general, I try hard not to give conclusions in which might sway people one way or the other. You know, people kind of are entitled to their own opinion. And my objective, so to speak, is just to try to empower people to make their own opinion with information.
So it's presenting the information, and then the listeners can come to their conclusions based on the information we present and the information they already have and the additional research they do after the fact. We should be flexible in the way we think about stuff.
Yeah, that's the ideal anyway. But if you don't want to be flexible, I can't make you, and I'm not going to try. You know, I just, again, the information is at your disposal for however you see fit as the listener, as the consumer.
And yes, his real name is John Smith.
Yeah, I'm not very good at coming up with screen names and fake names and the like. I pretty much just defaulted to John Smith.
Mm-hmm.
It's easy to remember too. Given my memory, that's a big advantage.
Yep.
So I can't really cover Syria in too much depth because there's a lot of moving parts. You know, if somebody wants to get more into that, we can, and I'll try to remember what I can. But if you really want to get into Syria, or well, more specifically, if you want to hear more analysis about Syria, I dig into it a lot more in the podcast over on SoundCloud, and I think there's a link somewhere for it. And that I go into that a lot more in a lot more detail than I can here off the top of my head. So if anybody's interested, you know, give that a try. Still new at podcasting, so I definitely encourage feedback. I'm very interested in what people have to say, positive or negative, you know, whatever kind of feedback. So that would be very welcome. Let's see. So that's the Syria question. North Korea. Is the Facebook privacy data scandal here to stay, or is the media fabricating a story? I don't think it's either. I don't think it's here to stay, but I don't think it's media fabrication either. You know, I think substantive issues have been raised by the whole Facebook Cambridge Analytica thing. The substantive issue, partly for Cambridge, on the part of Cambridge Analytica, has been that they have engaged in some shady activities in foreign countries, perhaps also Britain. I don't think data collection is among them. That's, you know, targeted advertising has been a part of political consulting and what have you, political campaigning for as long as there's been political campaigning. The data allows them to do that in a more exacting, precise fashion, but, you know, it's still not particularly impactful from what I've read about it. Again, if somebody knows better, let me know, but I don't think anybody's buying or selling elections like some people have been claiming. You know, I've read that in the media a couple times. That's hokum. You can't buy. Nobody knows enough about human nature in order to manipulate people into voting a certain way consistently. So whatever kind of influence they're having is pretty marginal. In a close election, it might make a difference, but, you know, in a close election, any number of things could make a difference. You know, I mean, the weather can make a difference in a close election. I wouldn't invest too much in that aspect of it. The more concerning is the other things, you know, the sort of honeypot operations, bribery, those kinds of things that have come out are a bigger concern. Those actually do represent some explicitly illegal activity. On Facebook's part, you know, Facebook has been pretty upfront that they steal your data and then sell, well, not even steal, that they take your data and sell it, and then that's part of the arrangement they have with people. You know, that's sort of part of the sort of agreement you make when you use the service. And a lot of social media companies have been like that. There are some that have been a little bit cagey about it, and there are some who have not really made it particularly easy to adjust your settings such that you can get around it. I think that aspect is more important to the story, and I think that's more what people are going to end up focusing on. But the notion that Facebook is just tricking people into giving up data and that kind of thing, I don't think that's true. I would disagree with that assessment.
There was an interview that I think Snowden shared from 2008 where Zuckerberg was claiming that the users own their data and what they do with it is their business. So maybe in more recent years they've been more upfront about it, but I think historically the idea of Facebook was supposed to be less invasive than it actually is.
Well, I'm sure Facebook would argue that everybody who uses Facebook is okay with the level of intrusiveness because otherwise they wouldn't be using it.
Yeah, no one.
Now, of course, that's highly debatable. Obviously, highly debatable. But that's Facebook's. That would be Facebook's counter, and you know, they have disclosure agreements, whatnot. You know, the fine print, the stuff you never read when you sign on to something. Basically, it's all in there hypothetically. And so, from Facebook's perspective, you know, they've done their due diligence, and that the people complaining have not done their due diligence, and that's more the source of the problem. Again, you could argue, and I think people are, and I think there's a good, you know, there's merit to the argument that companies like Facebook should be more upfront about what happens with data and what they do with data and the extent to which they gather your data. You know, I read the story recently about phone data and phone metadata being taken was a good example of that. You know, that they probably should have been a lot more upfront about that, because I don't think it's a stretch for people to assume that if you're going to have a service like that, that you would behave like a phone company and not just record all of your data and sell it to all and sundry. But I think that's going to be the crux of the debate going forward, more so than, you know, stealing data or what have you, or some of the more dramatic claims that have been made.
There was a graphic that was posted that was kind of the life cycle of different social media platforms, and I think with the relative size of Facebook, I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of the people who own the company and work for it have a feeling of invincibility, like a too big to fail kind of attitude, when I think part of the size of Facebook is just that more people are connected to social media now than ever before. So they should be much larger than MySpace. But MySpace fell over to Facebook. So is it possible that something else could take up that kind of role if people get pissed off enough at Facebook? I was AFK for a little bit. I don't know if you talked at all about Elon Musk's stunts with it.
Oh, no.
Did you see that, Ev?
Yeah, what was it? He was, I think I did anyway. You're referring to how he stated that he would remove his Facebook page?
Well, not just his, but also SpaceX and Tesla, I think. He deleted all of them in kind of a challenge. They were like, what do you think about Facebook doing all this stuff? And he was like, what's Facebook? And then deleted them. I was talking with PackFacts a little bit about Musk and his kind of ambition and whatnot, and how he wants to be emperor and king. He wants to be a big boss. Facebook is a big kid on the block, so for him to do something really strong like that sends a big message that I don't need you to be successful. I don't need Facebook's survival in order for me to keep advancing my plot, kind of a thing.
Yeah. Yeah, Elon Musk is a bit of a ham.
Yep.
So it doesn't surprise me that he would take that kind of action, you know, sort of for the attention. I guess I should specify what a ham is. That might confuse some people. In the United States, I don't even know how many people here even still use it. Saying somebody is a ham is sort of an old slang term to say that they're that they kind of overact, that they're a little bit overly, not even ambitious, just a little too much. They have a strong personality.
Big personality.
Yeah, there you go. Let's see. Oh, I might add here, just kind of as a footnote, or not a footnote, as a bookend for the Facebook question. Probably another part of the debate going forward is going to regard oh hell, what was it? Oh wow, that flew out of my head too, didn't it? I don't know. It was something. Maybe it'll come back to me later. Anyway, the next question. Hi from Mexico. I'm curious what you know about our presidential election. What have you heard? I think we are having the same political reality show you guys went through. I haven't been following the Mexican election too much. I should be following it more. It just kind of hasn't been in the news much. Mexico has a way of flying under the radar. It generally doesn't make headlines very often, and so it kind of goes unnoticed. I think I read something today about a corruption scandal that kind of broke out, that there was something like $200 million, a couple $100 million basically, that was basically disappeared. Supposedly the government used some transfer mechanisms. There's a mechanism by which different parts of the government, different agencies I assume, can transfer money between them, and supposedly this was used to kind of siphon off money into companies of one sort or another without having to go through the usual accounting practices. And that apparently is not really all that unusual, from what I read anyway. Please correct me if I'm wrong. But yeah, that's apparently gotten the government in trouble, and I think the government right now is the Institutional Revolutionary Party. I forget what the acronym is in Spanish. I forget the Spanish acronym for the party, but right now it's the Institutional Revolutionary Party, and they're in trouble. They haven't really been able to do a lot of what they promised they would do, which was to really increase business activity, improve the business environment, and to crack down on violence in Mexico by cartels and whatnot. And crack down on corruption. None of that has really happened in a substantive way, and so there's a lot of pressure on them. Of course, the trouble is the opposition, and I don't even quite remember what the opposition party was, but the opposition party, which had been in power before the current guy, I think the current guy is Neuro. Again, please correct me if I'm wrong. But before Neuro, the opposition was in power, and they also faced the same problems and also were kicked out for not being able to really address them. So I don't know that if the opposition party did get back into power, they would be able to really do much different. Again, I haven't been following the election closely enough to know what the opposition's platform is. So I don't know how much of a difference they would make if they actually did get back into power. And I don't think, the Institutional Revolutionary Party would do much different if they retained power. So I'm not really sure what's at stake, basically, in the election. I would have to read up on it to kind of have more clarity there. One thing I have been watching, and that I have heard of occasionally, is that Obrador is doing a lot better. And I'm probably mispronouncing his name. I'm probably misremembering his name. But Obrador is kind of this left-wing politician. Well, maybe not even left-wing. He's a sort of a left/populist politician in Mexico, and he's doing a lot better than he has in previous elections. He did pretty strongly, I think, way back in like 2005 or something like that. Sort of in the mid-aughts, I think I remember hearing about him more. And he was sufficiently upset at losing that election, or maybe it was just pure politics, but after the election, he disputed the election result and camped out with a bunch of supporters in Mexico City. It's kind of an early Occupy movement type thing. And he accused, he made accusations of fraud and that the whole process was corrupt, and that, he really won the election and all this kind of thing. Never really went anywhere, but he's kind of been a colorful figure, basically. That's an example of how he's a colorful populist type politician. And he's doing a lot better now, and there is some concern that maybe he could get into power and be very disruptive. I don't know how much he would really do about corruption. Populists always talk a big game about corruption and then end up being even more corrupt than the people they replace. But we'll see. I don't know. Again, I haven't been following the election closely enough to determine how well he's doing in the polls. But I do remember reading that he was doing disturbingly well, and that there is some concern about it. Certainly, it would be very interesting to have a populist Mexican president and a populist American president at the same time. There could be some friction there. That would certainly have an interesting impact on the ongoing renegotiation of NAFTA. That could end rather badly. Clashing personalities and whatnot. So if Obrador won, that would have potentially significant repercussions for Mexican-American relations, and we could be in for a rocky couple of years in that case. But I don't know that it's particularly likely that he would win. He's always been kind of more of a third-party type candidate in Mexico, and so he's gotten a chunk of the vote, but never a whole lot to really be threatening. So that's something to watch going forward. But beyond that, unfortunately, I haven't been watching enough to really give a more substantive analysis than that. Let's see, I would like to know what you think about the new German law, which gives police so much rights without a judge that they can imprison you with no proof of guilt. That's problematic. It's just in Bavaria right now, okay, but maybe it comes to whole Germany. If this will work, it's like 1945 all over again. I haven't read about this. I hadn't heard about it. I'll make a note here to kind of check it out later. Add this here, German law, Bavaria, arrest, cause, whatever. So I'll look into that. But unfortunately, I haven't read about it, so I can't comment too much on it. Given from what you wrote, that would be very disconcerting. The more discretionary power you give to a government or a government official or police, what have you, generally the more power, generally the more abuses there are. Sometimes it's necessary to give discretionary power for whatever mitigating circumstance there may be, or perhaps the gains from that discretionary power being given override the downside, the costs. But in principle, the more discretionary power you give, the more scope for corruption and abuse there is. And so that would be my principal concern with regard to this law as it's been described here in the question. If you can arrest people just sort of on a whim, without a judge, certainly imprisonment. Imprisonment implies punishment, which kind of cuts out the judiciary altogether. That's almost like a Judge Dredd type scenario where the police arrest you and sentence you to imprisonment without any kind of due process or judicial review.
I am the law.
Yeah, pretty much. So yeah, that would certainly be very disconcerting and problematic. I would be curious why Bavaria saw fit to pass such a law, or if there's more to the law than described here. There may be some more small print, so to speak, that limits the power being given somewhat. But again, without having read about it, I can't comment on it too much. Yeah, having an independent judiciary is pretty important if you want to maintain a responsible, well-functioning government. Having a good balance of power between your three branches, the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary. That's pretty important. And an independent judiciary that has real authority and whose authority is respected, those are all very critical to the functioning of a modern democratic state. And you sacrifice those at your own peril. So I would highly recommend kind of staying away from that if you're in a position to influence policy.
There's quite a bit of psychology literature and study on how humans approach morality, good and bad kind of behavior, and how much of it is situational, where you could have someone who is historically been a good person, but if they're tempted with a certain kind of scenario, then they'll do the wrong thing and oftentimes become more evil over time. I think it was Philip Zimbardo did a lot of studies on that. Some of them were not very ethical, kind of back in the 60s and 70s. But the idea was, rather than just thinking of people as good or bad apples, you also have good or bad barrels, which are situations, and then you have good and bad barrel makers, which are the people who create the situations. So for something like checks and balances, people are often hungry for power. If they can get more power and use it against other people, they will. So having some rules and barriers so people can't get all the power in the world end up being a net benefit. I think basically even some decent people could become evil if they're in the right situation, or you could say the wrong situation. Yeah. So something like that, maybe there are a lot of really good police workers in that area, but if they're presented with that kind of situation, there's a lot of room for them to abuse that power. So it could be a bad choice, even if you have mostly good cops in that area.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, unfortunately, it's kind of a truism that absolute power corrupts absolutely. Mm-hmm. It has that effect on you, and it can creep up on you, even if you're well-intentioned. There's lots of little shortcuts you can take when you have discretionary power. Sometimes you can justify yourself those abuses over time, such that they become ingrained. And it's very difficult to change an institutional culture once abuses like that do become ingrained like that. Let's see, so are you aware of Mexico politics about energy, etc.? What do you think about a country that owns every oil geyser? yeah, one of the big changes that was made by the during and after the Mexican Revolution in the early 20th century was that the nation's natural resources were largely nationalized, especially oil. That was the principal one. And that was done for nationalistic reasons. Basically, there was a fear of foreigners intervening and influencing Mexican politics. And, there was a desire to kind of expel that influence by nationalizing. And as far as that goes, it was very successful. American oil companies did not have a strong presence in Mexico after the Mexican Revolution, at least up until the 1940s or so, during World War II, when they were kind of let back in as to kind of help out with the war effort. The problem with nationalization is that there's not really good. You're not really. Let me put it like this: the people who manage the assets in question, the people who are responsible for managing production of the natural resources, for example, oil production, are not subject to market pressure, and as a result, they generally become kind of inefficient. That kind of goes back to what we were just talking about with absolute power and discretionary power, to a degree. It's kind of a rough analogy, but the idea is that if there's nothing stopping you, if there's nothing, well, let me put it like this: if there's nothing pushing you to be efficient and to really innovate constantly, to be constantly trying to figure out how to do things in the most efficient way, then eventually over the long term you kind of get lazier and lazier and you stop really bothering. And that's been a recurring phenomena in nationalized industries. In state-owned industries, generally production becomes very inefficient, generally management gets to be very apathetic, and production over the long term tends to fall, certainly stagnate at least. And that's kind of what happened with Mexico's oil production. Oil production started to stagnate around, I think, the 80s or 90s or so. Maybe later than that, I don't quite remember exactly. But basically, excuse me, basically because the government was not investing enough in modern technology, which is another problem. If you're not a market actor, it can be hard to constantly innovate and invest in research and development such that you constantly have the best technology. State-owned industries don't really care about that. They just kind of want the status quo. State-owned industries, I might add here as an aside, are very much political entities. They're generally treated as a kind of political spoil. It's a way to generate jobs and trade those jobs for political support. So the more people, state-owned industries tend to employ a lot more people than they actually need because of that political influence. And that also contributes to their inefficiency. But again, back to Mexico. Starting, sometime around the 90s or so, Mexican oil production started to stagnate, and that was partly because investment had tailed off. The government, partly because of apathy, but also partly because it was too expensive, had not been investing in modern production, and as a result, that impacted production negatively. That's just in conjunction with the inefficiency that comes with political influence and the lack of market incentives. And the result was that starting around, I want to say 2010, again, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I want to say like around 2010, the Mexican government announced that they would allow some foreign ownership of the Mexican oil company, the state-owned oil company. There's only one; it's a monopoly. And I don't quite remember what the name was. In Brazil, they call it Petrobras, but in Mexico, it's something else, and the name slips my mind. It's a well-known name. Anybody from Mexico would know it, like off the top of their head. But that company has traditionally, since the Mexican Revolution, been like 100% owned by the government. And I think there's even a clause in the Mexican Constitution that requires that company to be owned entirely by the government, or at least in large part. But I think the Neuro administration pushed for some privatization. I think they wanted to allow like up to 49%, not a majority, but up to 49% of the company to be owned by foreigners, so that foreign companies could come in and start investing in the company, modern technology, updating production, management practices, etc., to try to increase production, so that the state-owned oil company would start actually returning value again, instead of being a constant, basically, sink. When state-owned industries get really inefficient, they start to cost their government money to operate. Generally when they start out, they return a profit, and then that profit goes back to the government, and they can spend it how they see fit. But when it gets really inefficient, the government has to actually spend more tax money in order to subsidize the state-owned industry to keep it operating. and that ends up costing a lot of money. So there's a desire to increase production again by attracting foreign investment, so that the government can save money on subsidies, so that they can actually start getting a profit again. That's pretty much a general description of, that's kind of a case study in nationalization. You can see similar examples everywhere. That's actually what's kind of happening in Russia right now. A lot of Russia's oil assets were not nationalized, but they were distributed to Gazprom. A lot of foreign-owned assets were taken by the government for one reason or another, for one pretext or another, and distributed to government loyalists in the oil industry. But because the oil industry in Russia, as well as the gas industry, is such an important source of revenue for the government, and an important source of revenue for corrupt actors within the government, you need money like that you siphon off in order to buy loyalty and ensure patronage networks on which your hold on power relies. A lot of that money a lot of the profits from the oil and gas industry in Russia have been directed into for political purposes, and have not been invested back in the industries, such that they are now becoming inefficient, and production correspondingly has started to tail off a bit. And it's becoming kind of a big problem for the Russian government, because they need that oil revenue to keep increasing in order to continue paying for expansions in the military, expansions in other state programs, to continue paying pensions, etc., just to continue paying for various growing state obligations. So, these are just all examples of what happens when states nationalize industries in general, in particular natural resources. I'm sure there are some examples somewhere of some state that manages its assets relatively well. I'm sure that probably has happened somewhere, but generally in a lot of cases there's inefficiency and it kind of goes downhill. It doesn't really end badly very often. It takes a lot of professional management to make it work, and a lot of the countries that end up nationalizing state assets generally are poor and don't have very strong political institutions that can resist the temptation offered by easy profits from a nationalized entity. So Mexico, I imagine, is very similar in that regard. I've never read about the Mexican oil industry specifically. I've read a little bit about it while learning about some of these other aspects that I've talked about, nationalization, subsidies, etc. So I'm peripherally aware of the Mexican energy industry, but I can't say that I know a whole lot about it in particular. Let's see, so I apologize if I can't get more specific like this person wants, but that's pretty much what I can get off the top of my head. Let's see, so the next question was, why do you believe China has little interest in foreign politics while it continues to expand on its One Belt, One Road initiative? Yeah, the One Belt, One Road initiative is not like a big priority for the party. I think they did it much more just for domestic political reasons. It's an easy way to try to increase trade with other nations, so that you can increase the income of certain industries within China, in particular state-owned industries. Basically, there are two major industries that I can think of off the top of my head that the Chinese government would want to do a big initiative like the One Belt, One Road initiative for. One of those is state-owned industries. There's been, again, like I was saying before, state-owned industries are a big source of political support because you can have them hire more people than they need. You can trade jobs for political support. And as a result, state-owned industries in China are very inefficient. And the Chinese government wants to increase their revenue. And one of the ways to do that is to just increase sales. It would be better to increase productivity and efficiency, but that's very difficult to do for institutional reasons. Institutional reform is always difficult. It's much easier just to increase sales. So if you can make trade easier with neighboring nations, if not the rest of the world in general, you can stand to generate a whole lot more revenue, and that alleviates a lot of the pressure. So that's one big reason for the One Belt, One Road initiative. Another reason is modernizing industries. Basically, the Chinese government is pushing hard to modernize its economy. And one way it does that is to kind of prop up certain select industries it sees as kind of being the future, sort of technologically advanced industries that have large supply chains that can employ a lot of people, and that will help give help move the Chinese economy up the value chain. Right now they produce kind of low-value goods, shoes, toys, etc. They moved away from that more recently in the past 5-10 years towards more, techy, more productive production, things like that. But part of their strategy to continue that move and to try to accelerate it is to try to push industries like the train industry. High-speed rail has been an industry that's gotten a lot of support in China because they see that as a good way to try to develop, create jobs for educated people within China and to try to create positive externalities within the Chinese economy. And so part of what One Belt, One Road, a big part of One Belt, One Road is giving loans to participating states so that they can invest in infrastructure. And big surprise, a lot of Chinese firms, not only state-owned, but a lot of firms receiving Chinese government support in order to push development are also tied in some way to infrastructure. So the high-speed rail industry, for example, is inherently infrastructure. Like if you want to increase your transportation ties with another country, you could build a high-speed rail network, or maybe just a rail network, to that other country or to surrounding countries or within your own country to tie together regions that have not traditionally been well connected. And so countries that get loans for the One Belt, One Road program, a lot of them have invested in such infrastructure projects that have entailed giving contracts to Chinese companies. Not always high-speed rail in particular. High-speed rail has been one of them. I think Malaysia and Thailand have done that. But lots of different infrastructure companies in China have gotten business through the One Belt, One Road initiative and the loans that it's provided to other countries to pay for that. So in a sense, One Belt, One Road is more of a development strategy for China than it is about spreading influence to other countries. It's much more about domestic considerations than it is about expanding Chinese foreign influence and kind of having a bigger footprint, so to speak. So it's not really foreign policy so much as it is domestic policy. There is some foreign policy there, and there are going to be long-term ramifications in terms of the greater ability of China to influence its neighbors because of those closer economic ties that are facilitated by stronger infrastructure ties and stronger economic ties in general. But principally, it is a domestic consideration, which is why I say, again, that the Communist Party of China is not that interested in foreign policy, fundamentally. That doesn't mean that they never do it, but it just means that when they do it, it's more for domestic considerations. And really, if they really wanted to get into foreign policy, they would do a hell of a lot more than they do now, and they would certainly have a lot more capacity to do more than what they do now, if they really wanted to. And I think the reason they don't is because they don't. Hence the argument that they're not interested in foreign policy. Again, not an expert in a lot of this stuff I talk about, and I definitely welcome criticism from people who think contrary or who know something I don't know or what have you. Please do criticize and provide feedback. I definitely welcome that. I'm still new at this public speaking thing, and I want to get better at it. So, any help in that regard is appreciated. Let's see, China, what do you think of the use of prediction markets for forecasting economic and political events? Oh, wow, yeah, I think I remember what this is. This is like people trading on an exchange where the value of the items traded reflects the likelihood of an event happening. And so you can use the wisdom of the markets, quote unquote, to try to predict how well things, predict what will happen. And they used to be pretty accurate, but they've gotten a little shaky in recent years. And that's part of a general trend. Well, I guess let me answer the question first, and then I can kind of extrapolate. What do I think of the use of prediction markets? I mean, it's cute. I think it does accurately represent wisdom of the markets, per se, but it can only do that if a lot of people participate. Part of what makes markets wise, so to speak, according to the theory anyway, is that a lot of people participate who have a lot of different backgrounds and have a lot of information. If relatively few people participate in your prediction market, you're only really capturing what those participants know and not what the broader market knows. So participation is an important variable there. And even if you can get a lot of people to participate and can capture the wisdom of the market, so to speak, it's not going to matter much if the markets don't know what's going to happen. All you're going to capture then is the uncertainty. And that's what I was about to say, that the trend over the past few years has been more unreliable data. Traditionally, you can go out, do a survey, and try to get some idea, kind of poll people to get some idea of what they think and what's going, kind of generate a prediction based on that. But it's getting harder and harder to get people to respond to that kind of survey, to kind of respond to efforts to gauge opinion. And as a result, there's less information to work with, and as a result, there's more uncertainty. And because there's more uncertainty, something like a prediction market is only really going to be able to capture that uncertainty rather than give better guidance as to what's actually going to happen. You know, uncertainty is very much a defining characteristic of this current era that we're in. And prediction markets aren't going to be able to kind of penetrate that. But in general, they are pretty useful tools. They're an interesting tool, let's put it like that. Yeah, I don't know that there's really a lot of policy implications, though. I don't think you can really use them to design a better mousetrap, so to speak, to design a better policy of one sort or another for a given issue. You know, having an objectively optimal policy is nice, but a lot of what makes a policy good is broad perception that it's good and beneficial. And perception of policy rarely reflects how objectively good it is at achieving its objectives. You know, there's a lot of personal preference that goes into informing personal opinions about policies. And that's why having a democratic open political system is nice, because you can get people to kind of share those more openly. And people have more feedback then. So even if a policy is kind of crappy, if it satisfies people, it's very useful then, because you're helping kind of satisfy public demand for a given, you know, whatever it is the policy is providing. You're satisfying that public demand, and in turn, you're engendering stability. Whereas a government, like say an authoritarian government that emphasized objectively good policies above what the public wanted, even if the public wanted something stupid, they might get better functioning policies and more efficient policies, but they're also probably going to have more instability over the long term because the people feel that their needs are being denied. So you get some inefficient policies in the short run, those incur costs, but over the long run, you're a little bit better off because you're getting more political stability in your society and system. That's kind of one of the trade-offs between a democratic open system and a closed authoritarian system. And, you know, again, you can think what you want as far as which one you want. Again, personal preferences are informed by any number of factors. And so I'm not saying one is better than the other and that you should definitely always choose one or the other. You can reach your own conclusions there. But I'm just saying that is the trade-off there. And that's the trade-off that you're going to have to make in deciding between them, in whatever circumstance arises in which you would have to do that. Let's see. I understand you don't think a conflict would happen, but if conflict did happen, what kind of response do you think North Korea would have? It would depend on, we talked a little bit about this before, but basically to kind of briefly review, it would depend on the kind of conflict it was. I assume by conflict you mean war, and that implies an active attempt to try to take territory. So if there were an actual war in which I don't even know. It would really depend on the circumstance. Hypothetically, you could have a war where North Korea is just purely on the defensive against a South Korean and American offensive, or you could have a war where the North Koreans go on the offensive and try to take the southern part of the Korean peninsula. Both of those sound kind of outlandish to me, though. That's the thing, because North Korea knows it can't win such a war. So I don't think it would even try to fight it. It would probably use asymmetric methods of retaliation, you know, assassination, cyber attacks. Not a big fan of the idea of cyber attacks. I think of it more as cyber espionage, but moot point, semantics. They would probably do more of that, and you know, just be more disruptive in general. You know, more actively engaging in the black market, in smuggling, what have you. But I don't know that there's a lot they could do violently. There would be a limit. They might do some minor things. They might engage some minor attacks against American assets in South Korea, possibly also against South Korean assets. The tricky thing about South Korea is that relations with South Korea and North Korea have been improving somewhat, purposely so because of North Korean effort. So if the United States did attack North Korea directly, would it be fair to South Korea then to punish South Korea with some kind of attack against South Korea, given that they were reciprocating against the Charm Offensive and were probably opposed to unilateral American action? There's a conundrum there for the North Koreans, because then they can't really retaliate against South Korea without pissing them off and eliminating any potential for improving ties there. But then, if they can't retaliate against the United States by attacking South Korea, how can they retaliate? There's not a whole lot they can do. It's not like they can attack the United States, you know. Even attacking something like Okinawa or some such would be difficult for them. So they have very limited options. They could use nuclear weapons, but that would end very badly for them. Again, like we were discussing before, if they use nuclear weapons, the United States would probably retaliate with nuclear weapons of its own, and you know, it would entirely be within American doctrine to retaliate massively. Massive nuclear retaliation would entail just obliterating North Korea, basically. And that is possible. And that doesn't end well for the North Korean government, and like I said before, the principal imperative of the North Korean government is to stay in power. Being annihilated in a nuclear holocaust does not facilitate staying in power, so I'm a little skeptical they would even risk it.
It's not very fun either.
No, I don't imagine it would be. Being vaporized is probably no good. Actually, being vaporized is probably preferable, though, to being on the outside of the nuclear blast, because then you're getting incinerated, you know, or badly burned, or otherwise being killed in probably a somewhat slower, more painful way than just being utterly obliterated near the center of the blast. Mind you, the United States would probably be using thermonuclear weapons, which are probably significantly more powerful and destructive than anything North Korea has. So there's just an inherent imbalance of power there. And while it might sound weird to say, you know, one nuclear weapon is more powerful than the other, they're all nuclear weapons, aren't they? Well, keep in mind that one of the reasons the United States came out on top in the Cuban Missile Crisis is because of the disparity in nuclear power between the Soviet Union and the United States. The United States had a lot more nuclear weapons, and it had much more long-range nuclear weapons than the Soviets did, and that was part of the reason the Soviets felt that they could not really compete. They could not really continue to confront the United States over the Cuban issue. If there were a war, the United States would escape relatively unscathed, which meant that American threats of starting a conflict were much more credible than Soviet threats. That disparity, by the way, between Soviet and American power is one of the reasons the Soviets always tried to bullshit everybody. You know, the Soviet strategy was always to try to appear more powerful than they were in order to ward off threats, and that's a strategy that the Russian government now has basically pretty much inherited, to try to appear more powerful than they are in order to deter aggression of one sort or another. That's not to say that the Soviets and the Russians today are not powerful, just that relative to American power at that time, and the disparity continues now, is relatively great. That disparity closed in the 70s and 80s. The Soviets had a lot more power then. They went out of their way to close that gap after the Cuban Missile Crisis. But at that time, the Soviets only had a handful, I think, maybe at most a dozen or two intercontinental ballistic missiles. And they didn't really have I guess they had just gotten, pretty much, a nuclear bomber. The Tu-95, I think, was, what, 54 or 55, thereabouts? But it's easier to shoot down a bomber than it is an ICBM. So if all you have are nuclear bombers that have nuclear weapons, that's not as credible a threat as having an ICBM. And the Russians did not have very many at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The United States, in contrast, had a whole bunch. So even if you have nuclear weapons of equivalent power, the disparity in nuclear power can lead states to adjust their behavior for fear of a nuclear conflict. So that's the same dynamic happening here. Even though both the United States and North Korea both have nuclear weapons, the United States has a big edge, and that edge is recognized by the North Korean government and is probably partly informing their strategy in relation to the United States. So again, the question specifically was, what do I think the North Koreans would actually do? Probably not a whole lot that would be really dramatic. There is kind of a question as to whether they would directly attack American assets or whether they would just focus on South Korea, destabilizing South Korea and just causing trouble. I don't know. I think at the very least they would take asymmetric action. Possibly, if they were feeling really risk tolerant, they might attack directly some American assets. But I think whatever they did would be proportional to any potential action the United States takes. Like if there were American airstrikes in North Korea, I suspect that North Korean retaliation would be proportional, because they would fear something out of proportion might lead to escalation. That, again, they probably really don't want. Cannot really afford. Let's see, so the next question was, what are your thoughts on our future relationship with Mexico? Again, I assume by our you mean the United States. My thoughts on the future relationship with Mexico? I think Mexican-American relations partly will kind of go back to what we were talking about before with the Mexican elections. It partly will depend on who wins the elections. If Obrador wins, and again, I apologize if I'm getting the name wrong, but if Obrador wins, that's going to throw a wrench in Mexican-American relations for sure. That's going to create some tensions there, and I don't really know how that'll play out. It kind of just depends on preferences in Washington and in Mexico City at that point. Probably, I would guess that Obrador would not win. I imagine that's most likely. I would want to read more about the election to commit more, but I suspect either the Institutional Revolutionary Party or the principal opposition party will probably win the Mexican election. And in that case, it's probably just going to be more of the same, more status quo. Other than the Mexican election, what other factors will influence the future Mexican-American relations? Partly American domestic political considerations. Obviously, there's a sort of rising trend of politics in the United States that is particularly concerned about immigration. And a lot of that concern focuses on immigration from Mexico, which, somewhat ironically, actually started to really significantly tail off a few years ago. Actually, it was more than a few years ago. I think immigration from Mexico has been depressed since the 2008 financial crisis. Yeah, there's a combination of less economic activity in the United States after the '08 financial crisis and better Mexican economic performance since then that have combined to limit the incentive, to mitigate the incentive to migrate to the United States, with the result that Mexican migration is actually down pretty significantly, I think. There might have been some ups and downs since then, but in general, I think the trend is actually pretty strongly down. Again, if I'm wrong on that, please correct me, but that was my impression. But regardless, there's an impression that immigration is a problem, and that immigration from Mexico in particular is a problem. And so as that particular political faction gains prominence, that could create a lot more tensions. But I don't know how much practically they're actually going to do. And there's a couple reasons for that. For one, even in cases where nations have tense relations, if they have strong ties economically, for example, or some other good reason to cooperate, generally they put aside their differences and focus on that. It's pretty rare for things like immigration or other, whatever hot button issue there might be between two countries to result in the sacrifice of cooperation. Tensions have to get really bad for that to happen. And in particular, because a lot of the rhetoric regarding Mexico within the United States, and probably also within Mexico regarding the United States, a lot of that rhetoric is done more for political reasons than it is for substantive policy reasons. I don't think there's really a strong enough desire to really take strong action against Mexico in the United States, or against the United States and Mexico, to really lead to a significant break in relations. More accurately, to lead to actions by one government or the other that would lead to a break in relations. I think a lot of the politics between Mexico and the United States is kind of sound and fury more than substance. So I don't read too much into that kind of rhetoric. Another factor to keep in mind is that there's still a significant significant body of political interests within the United States that favors migration from Mexico. Probably better known among them is the political left in the United States, which is more favorable to immigration, which is a little bit weird. I'm still getting used to that. It wasn't like that when I was a kid. When I was a lot younger, 10, 20 years ago, that was not really considered like a leftist position. But American politics has evolved in kind of a weird way over the past 10 years, such that it is kind of considered to be a leftist position, to be very pro-immigration. So there's a big body, there's a big political interest there on the left in keeping in maintaining immigration from Mexico. And lesser known, another political faction that is very pro-immigration is actually business conservatives. That particular faction is kind of on the decline. Their power is kind of on the decline relative to what you could call the populist faction of conservative politics. But business conservatives are still a very powerful political group. They've always had disproportionately influential voice in policy making and in politics generally. And in general, they're at the very least relatively pro-immigration. And I might add that a lot of pro-business conservatives have been pretty cagey about their adherence to certain immigration rules. It's not hard to find examples of businesses in the United States that have hired a lot of illegal immigrants, more or less knowingly. They pretend not to know, but kind of they do know, but they just don't push it because they like the cheap labor. There's a lot of businesses like that in the United States, and has been for a long time. And, from their perspective, they're not hurting anybody. For them, it's helping their business and making them more competitive. And of course, if you're an immigrant laborer, probably from Mexico, you don't really see it as a problem because, it's people quibble about whether it's true that Americans won't do certain jobs, but I don't think it's a stretch that there are at least some jobs that a lot of Americans will just won't do. It's very hard to attract American labor to, say, picking fruit or something like that, or a lot of carpentry type jobs.
Building houses in the heat of a Texas summer.
Yeah, that's no joke. I've seen people get heat stroke doing that. It's not easy work. But I'm sure there are some American laborers who have been negatively impacted by the pressure brought on wages by significant immigration. But in general, there's not a lot of those people. That's kind of the argument for immigration, that there's not really a whole lot of people who are really being impacted, and that the Mexican laborers themselves benefit a great deal, and that having that labor come in benefits the economy overall because you have more economic activity. Whether or not illegal immigration causes a significant burden on finances in localities and state government, if not the national government, that's a whole other conversation. We can get into that if somebody wants, but that's kind of more of a tangent. I'm already off on a couple of tangents away from the original question, so I'll leave that for later.
If people want a silly movie that kind of presents a lot of that Texas-Mexico relationship, watch Machete.
Well, I don't know how strong a documentary that is.
It's not, but I think it captures the spirit of how a lot of people think about it. Like, it shows that business conservative kind of attitude. It shows the hardworking Mexican immigrants and stuff, and just the citizenry and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, Texans and Mexicans generally get along. I grew up around Mexicans. There were a lot of Mexicans around, in my high school even. So, perfectly normal for me. I think it's interesting that the regions of the United States, and I think this is also true in Europe, if not just universally, the regions of the United States that are most anti-immigration generally are the regions that receive some of the least immigration. Yeah. So Texas, for example, I know Texas, I live there. I'm also from Texas, and live in Texas like Neuro here. And probably also California. This is also probably true of California, New Mexico, Arizona, etc. All of these places have significant populations of Mexicans, and a lot of the people there don't really have a big problem with them per se. There's some issues here and there, but I don't hear nearly as much whining in Texas, for example, than I do in, say, North Carolina or in the Midwest or what have you, places like that, where they're not really used to immigration from Mexico. Some people might quibble and say not every immigrant laborer in Texas is from Mexico, but most of them are. Trust me, most of them are. We do get some from Central America and some other places, but like 90% must be from Mexico.
Well, one of the things that we talked about before as well with the establishment of Texas as part of the United States Union is that it has not always been the case that there was a strict line between the U.S. and Mexico. Like, Texas used to be part of Mexico. So to be xenophobic about Mexican immigrants in Texas is hilarious, historically speaking. Yeah, there are strong ties there, strong economic ties. In fact, I'm kind of interested, still am actually, to see whether Texas won't be a significant source of opposition to any significant NAFTA renegotiation that results in a significant change in status quo. Because Texas has benefited a lot from NAFTA. There's been a lot of industries in Texas that have made a lot of money selling goods and services to Mexico. And they would have still made money without NAFTA, but they made a lot more because of it. So I wonder whether Texas, which voted pretty solidly for Trump, and maybe it's closer than it used, well, that's a whole other conversation, but pretty pro-Trump in general, but I think they might
oppose that particular policy because NAFTA is kind of a big part of the Texas economy. So you could see in the future at some point, possibly, something to watch, you could possibly see Texas politicians and Texas political leaders come out against Trump if there were a big move against the NAFTA agreement in Washington. Anyway, the original question were thoughts on the future relationship with Mexico. I guess to kind of bookend that, I don't think there's a lot of changes on the horizon. You know, unless tensions really ramped up for some reason, I don't really think there would be any significant change in the status quo. And I think even if tensions did ramp up, it would probably be for some bullshit political reason. You know, something that was played up to win political votes more than anything. So I don't really see any substantive changes in policies in that regard. Probably the biggest potential change would come in the form of NAFTA, you know, the NAFTA renegotiation, but, you know, I haven't seen a lot of traction there. And the government is actually receiving a lot of feedback, a lot of pushback from a lot of different industries and interest groups on that count. You know, the Trump administration had been pushing basically to favor American manufacturing. That's kind of their modus operandi in terms of renegotiating the agreement, if not trade policy generally. But the thing is, that would probably encompass less benefits for the American agricultural sector. And so a lot of agricultural interest groups, which are very powerful in American politics, are putting a lot of pressure on the Trump administration not to significantly abridge the NAFTA agreement in a way that would impact their interests. And given that that's a big part of his constituency, given that, you know, rural America, so to speak, is one of the sort of his principal supporters in the 2016 election, that's a lot of pressure to bring. That's a lot of pressure. He's feeling a lot of pressure from them, I suspect. And so I imagine that probably his efforts to kind of blow up NAFTA, so to speak, if indeed that's even what he wants to do, probably not, but any significant change he wants to make will probably meet a lot of resistance that might stop him from doing so. So NAFTA renegotiations may well end up being relatively mild, a lot milder than people expect. I suspect that if that's the case, then the Trump administration will extract some kind of symbolic concession from Canada and Mexico in that regard, so that he can say that he got a big concession when really maybe he didn't. You know, I was talking with some people today about a concession he supposedly got from South Korea. You know, there was this big kerfuffle about steel tariffs and about getting exemptions for steel tariffs from allied countries. You know, a lot of countries that were impacted by those tariffs were confused as to why American allies were also being impacted, and nominally it was because the Trump administration wanted to extract quote-unquote deals from those nations. But a lot of the deals that were made in exchange for exemptions were kind of, you know, empty, basically. And the South Korean example was the South Korean government agreed to increase the import quota for American cars, which would seem to be a big win until you find out that actually American automakers were not maxing out that quota before. You know, there was, let's say, 1 million cars that American exporters could export to South Korea. Well, they were only exporting maybe 800,000. So increasing the quota doesn't really do much. You know, it doesn't really change anything. But it makes for a great headline. It's good politics. And there's been kind of a lot of that in trade policy in the United States over the past year and change. You know, kind of a lot of talk, a lot of sound and fury, a lot of symbolic gestures, but not a whole lot of substance really done. That could change at some point. You know, the Trump administration has done progressively more substantive things in regards to trade policy over the course of its existence. But thus far, while it has been getting more substantive, it hasn't really become substantive yet. It's not really at a point where it's really significantly threatening the status quo yet. So basically, in a nutshell, those are my thoughts on the future relationship with Mexico. That's a prime example of a meandering answer. It's just all over the place. So I apologize for the messy answer. Hopefully it was coherent enough to make some kind of sense and to give some kind of closure to the person asking this. Let's see. As a foreigner, I've read that import taxes target China, especially since they are accused of stealing ideas. I would like to understand which ideas specifically and how the steps from the U.S. government would stop that stealing in the future. Yeah, that's an interesting question. specific ideas, there's been a number of intellectual property cases brought actually in China even. And I think one of them was won, actually, which is a bit unusual. I can't remember, I think it was Apple. I want to say it was Apple that had brought an IP case in China and won it. And people were kind of surprised by that, since normally foreign corporations don't do so well in IP cases in China. But I think it was like some obscure sort of... Generally, the intellectual property being violated is very techie type stuff. It's stuff that's kind of... If you're not techie yourself, and I'm not, it's kind of hard to penetrate. So it's, you know, things like designs for chips or programs or things like that. And I don't... Off the top of my head, beyond the Apple example, I can't think of anything specific. But in general, technology is generally what's of concern. I mean, there's traditionally been IP violations of things like movies and, you know, luxury goods, you know, bootleg Gucci purses or what have you. But generally, the United States government hasn't cared as much about that because it's not really that impactful. I mean, okay, you bought a bootleg Gucci purse, who cares? Gucci is negatively impacted. Who cares about Gucci? They're not really a big player in Washington. So what is impactful, what is problematic is technology, because technology could give the Chinese government, and by extension the Chinese military, a technological advantage, or at least technological parity with the US military. And that strategic consideration is why the United States government is growing more and more concerned with IP violations and IP rule of law within China, because it does want to prevent the leakage, so to speak, of American, if not, you know, Western in general, advanced technology from falling into the hands, so to speak, of the Communist Party of China. There are certain technologies that the United States, for strategic reasons, does not want the Chinese government and the Chinese military to have access to. And the interconnectedness between the Chinese and American economy and investment flows make it kind of hard for the United States to determine, you know, what investments the Chinese Chinese economic actors, I should say, to find out what investments Chinese economic actors make in American tech companies that are done purely for market reasons, and which are done at the implicit beckoning of the Communist Party of China. In other words, there may be some investing that goes on because the party encourages investment, if not direct some investment, into certain technologically sensitive industries, so that it can take those, so that it can transfer those technologies back to China and share them with companies in China. That's sort of the crux of the concern, and that's more the area of intellectual property violation that the government is worried about and is focusing on. So I apologize again for not being able to give you more specific examples. The example I can remember is the Apple example, and I know there are more examples like that. I just can't remember them, but they pop up occasionally. You know, if you try to Google a list, I'm sure you could find a whole bunch of them. Let's see, especially since they're, so that's the first part of the question. I've read that the import taxes, I would like to understand which ideas specifically and how the steps from the U.S. government would stop that stealing in the future. The steps the U.S. government are taking pretty much focus on a congressional body called the Congressional Committee of Foreign Investment, something to that effect, like the CFIUS, I think is what the acronym is. And this congressional committee is tasked with investigating foreign, basically, investment and mergers or what have you, that into sensitive areas, specifically as they relate to American national security. And this body has been growing a lot more active over the past years. Part of that is probably because the Trump administration wants to put more pressure on China generally, but this is also kind of a secular trend that goes beyond the Trump administration. There's kind of been a rising trend of more action by this committee looking into Chinese investment into the United States. And the committee's principal tool with which to kind of control this, to manage this issue, is to block investments. They can look at a proposed investment into an American company, and they can say, okay, that investment is a danger to national security, we're going to disallow this. And they have the authority to do that. Whether or not that actually really stops the Chinese government or Chinese companies from infringing on intellectual property, that's more debatable. It's probably a pretty weak tool, really. I mean, honestly, given how effusive modern technology is, given how easily technology and technological designs move around the world, it's probably a losing effort to try to control it. So you can stop some Chinese investment from coming in and kind of gaining access to technologies that have military uses or dual uses or what have you. But they're probably going to end up getting it at some point anyway. I mean, a lot of technology is off the shelf now, and so if they really wanted it, they could just take it, buy it off the shelf, and reverse engineer it somehow. Or they could engage in some kind of cyber espionage and steal the design, or they could invest in the company through like a third-party company in another country. I mean, there's a lot of ways to do it. So in general, there is concern about this issue in the United States. There is some merit to it, but there's very limited capacity to really do anything about it. And there is kind of a trade-off there between allowing a more open market that allows more money. You know, Chinese money is money too, so that money helps the development of the market in the United States if it's coming in. So there is this trade-off in restricting investment flows into that sector and having a better, more economic development, basically, more dynamic economy, and having a more dynamic tech sector. You know, restricting Chinese investment in conjunction with stricter immigration rules, which has already impacted any number of people. You know, if you're an immigrant in the U.S., you know all about it. Those two factors combined are probably not great for the American tech sector. And there is some question as to whether the long-term impact of the two combined could be to push some tech development outside of the United States. And if that happens, then the U.S. government basically has no power to control the diffusion of advanced technologies through China, because it's unlikely that a lot of the places that these tech companies could relocate to would be as interested in stopping Chinese investment of the sort that is of concern. So it's a very difficult problem to address, and I don't know that the U.S. government can actually do anything about it. That doesn't mean they shouldn't try to do something about it, but the tools they have at hand are very limited in their effectiveness, just because of the nature of the modern economy. It may be better to try to pass structural reforms that improve American competitiveness in these areas, such that they're constantly developing bleeding-edge technology that the United States government has at least relatively more access to. And that would do more probably to preserve the American technological edge than trying to erect barriers, which are not very effective at stopping anything. You know, they're pretty shitty barriers, basically.
We've touched on this in a couple other sessions. The fence, the border fence that Bush put up, is something that is very easy to work around, mainly holes under it. So you could imagine if someone can dig a hole and go under a fence, they could just as easily do the same thing to a wall. The wall goes further up, but if they're not going over it, then it's just for show. So a lot of the build a wall stuff is more pandering to the base rather than an effective solution to something that isn't even really a problem. But it gets the crowd hyped up for his rallies and stuff.
Yeah, it's good politics. It's effective. I mean, technically you could, hypothetically, you could build an effective barrier that would include a lot of different things, not only a wall, but also what they would call like an electronic fence, a lot more observation, more border guards, what have you. Hypothetically, that's possible, but it would be very expensive. Like if you wanted to do it like the Israelis do it, because the Israelis have all kinds of fancy crap over there. They even have tunnel detection systems now, tunnel detection technologies they've developed to try to get around people digging under them. But doing that in Israel is very different than doing it in the U.S., because Israel's borders are pretty small. And the U.S.-Mexico border is one of the longest borders in the world. You know, it ranks up there. It's one of the longer ones, and that's a lot of area to cover. And so covering it in depth all along the border would be extremely expensive. And if you look at the cost-benefit, I don't know that the cost from illegal immigration is all that high. There are probably more effective ways to deal with illegal immigration that would be a lot more impactful and cost-effective than trying to build some kind of massive security apparatus along the border. Now, of course, that's a matter of opinion. Everyone is entitled to entitled to their own opinion on that, to reach their own conclusion. But the cost-effectiveness of a barrier in the Trump style that is being proposed is not particularly cost-effective, from what I've read about it. Let's see. We doing okay on time?
Yep, we got 15 minutes.
Oh shit, 15 minutes. Got a bunch more questions. We had a lot today.
Yeah, well, the viewership has been over 1,000 almost the whole time.
Oh wow.
Yeah. We big potatoes now. We got a bunch of momentum from the achievement hunt, and then I went hard with that 24-hour. It's been kind of a way to really push the product out there. Because a lot of people on Twitch, they haven't discovered all the streams. It's more of the random chance of you're flipping through channels based on what the highest viewership ones are. And sometimes you find this channel, but most people who watch Twitch do not know about this channel. So every little event like that that puts the name out there increases the chance that they'll be introduced to it and could follow and continue to hang out.
Wow. Well, very nice. I'm glad the stream is very healthy, and you were able to kind of leverage that into some real there. Well done.
Yeah, we actually broke 600 subscribers today.
Oh, nice. Oh, today?
Yeah, just today.
Congratulations.
Thanks.
Yeah, moving on up. Let's see. So I guess I'll just try to do as many as I can in the 15 minutes we have left here.
Sure.
Do you think Cuba's embargo will be lifted soon? Definitely not. It costs the United States pretty much nothing to maintain the embargo. And, you know, when the Obama administration suggested, you know, started lifting some of the embargo, there was a big backlash amongst a lot of conservatives. And so the Trump administration likes to take certain actions in order to contrast itself with the Obama administration in order to get, you know, kind of get political points, basically. And kind of reversing the move towards lifting the embargo has been part of that. So unless Cuba is willing to give significant concessions, I don't think the Trump administration would be willing to entertain the notion of lifting the embargo. Maybe after the Trump administration, there will be some move back towards that, back towards lifting the embargo. But for now, the domestic political considerations in the United States do not facilitate that, like, at all. So I don't see it as being on the table for at least the next, when it was 16, when is the next election? 2020, right? That's the next presidential election. So at least the next 2 years or so, it's probably off the table completely. If the Trump administration gets another 4 years after that, you're looking at 6 years. And maybe even after that, depending on how things pan out. But certainly not anytime soon. Let's put it like that. Are other countries fine with China flooding certain markets without any chance to compete? No, they are not. Actually, there's a lot of opposition to that. A lot of countries have a problem with it. The problem is that no one country has enough leverage to bring against China to kind of get it to change. I think we were talking a bit about this before. If you want to really put pressure on China to compete more fairly, you would need a multilateral approach that takes all of China's trade partners and kind of gets them together. No one country has enough leverage to do that, but there's no sign that's going to happen anytime soon, so it's not likely. But certainly, Chinese dumping of certain goods is an issue. You know, steel dumping, for example, and dumping of certain other products is a definite issue in a lot of countries. And even Chinese competition in general, where there's no dumping, just Chinese competition in general, is becoming more of a political issue in a lot of places. You know, there's more and more of a Chinese presence in Africa. And as that Chinese presence grows, you know, as Chinese companies compete more and more in Africa, there's more and more consternation, basically, with that competition. And, you know, some of it's fair, some of it's not. Whether or not it's fair isn't the point. The point is that this group has come in and offered competition to native groups, and those native groups resent it. And they feel that they shouldn't have to put up with it. And the more cutthroat that competition becomes, the more cutthroat that sentiment becomes, and the more tension there is. For now, it's not too big a deal. But it's only going to grow as China's economic presence, economic footprint in Africa grows, among other places as well. But certainly, other countries take issue with it. It is an actual problem. When it's dumping, anyway. Let's see, what's your overall opinion about the gaming industry, the economy, consumption, and piracy of it in general? I haven't read too much about the gaming industry. I think it's doing pretty well. Certainly the console gaming industry always has done well, so I don't know that there's any problem there. The PC and gaming industry is kind of hot and cold. It's always been on more shaky ground, because the market is not as large. You know, having a high-end computer is a lot more expensive than getting a console. And generally, consoles last a while. You can generally buy a lot of games with them, but PCs, you kind of have to constantly upgrade, and it's expensive, and, you know, there are tech problems. You know, sometimes something is not compatible with something else, and that causes problem with a given game, so you're never entirely sure your computer will play something right. And yeah, it's just kind of a more difficult market, basically. And as a result, PC gaming is rarely growing as much as they would like. It was actually much better, much stronger, I think, in the early 90s. And it's kind of been up and down since then. It's relatively healthy. I don't think it's going to disappear, but, you know, if there were a major crisis of some kind, it would have a big problem. You know, the console gaming market is just way more lucrative. But overall, I think the trend is pretty good. I don't see any indication that it's going anywhere, that it's going to disappear anytime soon. But without reading more about the gaming industry and how it's performing and more detailed stuff than that, I can't really comment intelligently about it. So I apologize. I can't go into it too deeply. Let's see. Is it right to assume now that the Skripal case currently, quote-unquote, only destabilizes the relationship between the EU and Russia, which might have been able to foresee beforehand, which might have... Also, why did UK refuse to answer Russia's question after being accused of being the country behind the assassination? Let's see, so two-part question. Is it right now to assume that only destabilizes relations between the EU and Russia? Not quite, because a lot of other countries have, quote-unquote, expressed solidarity with the UK. I think the United States, obviously, is the big example, but also a handful of other countries. I think Japan was considering it. I don't quite recall if they actually went anywhere with that. But it is more widespread. It isn't just the EU. But I would also repeat what I said earlier, which is that while it has disrupted relations, it hasn't really substantively disrupted relations. Again, expelling diplomats is kind of the diplomatic equivalent of cheap talk. It's not like a really big move. It doesn't really cost you to expel another country's diplomats. You know, you just replace them in a couple months. You know, it's more of a symbolic action. So I wouldn't read too much into it. It's more of a media circus at this point than it is any kind of real strategic shift. I mean, basically, the fundamental underlying relationship and tensions between Russia and Europe and the West in general, those remain more or less unchanged. Let's see, so that's the first part of the question. Why did the UK refuse to answer Russia's question after being accused of being the country behind the assassination? Why did from what I remember, from what I read anyway, at least I have it in my notes, the UK did offer to allow the Russians to participate in the investigation, but did not respond before the deadline they had set. I read that somewhere. Make of that what you will. I haven't really followed up on it much. It probably wouldn't have mattered even if they had. So, as for why the UK refused to answer Russia's, I'm not sure what specific question would be asked. If you're talking about Russia's government, the Russian government did request a sample of the nerve agent that was used, so that they could judge for themselves where it had come from and, you know, what have you. And the British government has not, you know, proffered that sample yet. If I had to, you know, the real answer here is I don't know. I don't know why London decided not to do that, if that is the question you're referring to here. If I had to guess, I would say that they didn't trust the Russians to be honest with whatever findings they had. It may be that London just assumed that if the Russians were given a sample, they would do tests on it, and then whatever the result of the test was, they would just come out and say that it wasn't them regardless. So if you think that they're not going to be honest about it, why bother in the place? That's just a guess. Again, I don't really know. You know, so your guess is as good as mine in that regard. There are still a lot of questions as to just why and how the whole thing happened. Again, it's not clear just what Russia really gains by doing this, and I don't think they would do it unless they had something substantive to gain. So I'm a little skeptical that it was really the Russian government going out of their way to do this. I think if they had any involvement, it was either really peripheral or perhaps kind of unknowing. I don't think like the very top approved it, if it was involved at all. Let's see. So roughly, that's my impression. These are my impressions of the issue at hand here. You know, again, there are so many uncertainties, it's really hard to pin down exactly what happened, and again, culpability, and why London, for example, is acting the way it's acting. Let's see, I'm sorry, that's not a great answer, I know, but that's my impression of it. What is the actual effect of the GOP tax cuts? I've read that the benefits for most Americans are mostly meaningless. Yeah, kind of the long-term benefit is pretty marginal for people. In the short term, there's been like some increases in bonuses and pay, but you know, over the long term, that's not going to mean as much. The long-term effect on the economy will be larger. I think the short-term impact is relatively low, but the long-term impact on the economy will be pretty positive. You know, that's not hard. You know, that's just in general more money for the private sector. So of course it would do better than it would otherwise. But as for individuals, individual workers, they're seeing more of a goose in the short term than they'll probably see in the long term. I don't know. I haven't read the research specifically on how tax policy interacts with wages. So I don't know how much transference there actually is when supply-side measures like this reform are implemented, and how much impact they actually have on wages. I would suspect that wages are probably more informed by other factors than they are by tax policy, unless the tax policy change in question is really dramatic. So probably whatever changes in wages happen going forward will probably be due to those factors rather than a big tax cut. The principal gains of the tax cut are going to go towards corporations. That was sort of the crown jewel of the tax cut. I think we talked pretty in depth about the tax cuts a couple months ago, and from what I remember, the crown jewel of the tax reform was the cut in the corporate income tax, which had been relatively high relative to peer nations, and they cut that down to, I think, about 20–21%, something like that. So that was the gist of it. That was the main thing they wanted to do, and most of the rest of the bill was designed around generating revenue to offset the loss in revenue from the fall in corporate tax cut in the corporate tax rate. There were some other tax cuts thrown around as well, but they were very minor, pretty small potatoes compared to the big tax cut. You know, sort of the main goal, the main objective of the reform. So yeah, probably it's not. I think easily most of the benefits will go to corporations. Again, some of that is going to bleed over to individual workers, wages, what have you. But probably not a whole lot. I think in general, the opinion in economics right now is that supply-side economics is not really substantive. Like any positive effect from supply-side reforms like that is relatively negligible. Over the long term, it has more of an impact, but over the short and medium term, not much. And even over the long term, the gains are pretty meh. You know, if you really want to goose the economy, generally it's better to go with structural reforms of some kind, much larger than anything you could do with taxes probably, and goose fiscal stimulus, in addition to perhaps monetary stimulus if circumstances allow. That's kind of the trifecta of things the trifecta of approaches you would take if you just wanted to focus narrowly on boosting growth. Let's see, what's your overall opinion of the economic in general? What is the actual effect of the tax cuts? Well, yeah, okay, I got it. Okay, we basically covered that. Okay, if I haven't covered the crux of the question, please say so, and maybe we can get back to it later, or maybe next week, since I'm sure we're almost out of time. Do I have any time?
If we go like 5 minutes over, I'm not going to be mad.
Okay.
We have tons of questions, so if Fuzzycourt's tired, he can go rest.
Let's see, what are your thoughts on the Iranian nuclear program? I remember there was some conflict about that in the past, but I haven't heard anything about it recently. Yeah, there's still conflict about that, because the Trump administration is very hawkish about the nuclear deal that was signed, and they would prefer to renegotiate the deal such that it's harsher and that there's more certainties as far as whether or not they're actually disarming, whether or not they're actually adhering to the agreement. And failing that, maybe even direct airstrikes against the facilities, the pertinent facilities. And you could see that in the next couple months, because one of the provisions in the Iranian nuclear agreement is that I think it's the president, the executive branch, has the power to verify that Iran is adhering to the agreement, and they have to verify it every couple of months, and if they don't, then there's a bunch of sanctions that snap back into place, and the agreement is kind of, the United States basically in that case, kind of pulls out of the agreement. So this is every 6 months to a year, I think, that the administration has to do that. And the last time it came up, the administration only very grudgingly did it, basically on the condition that there would be some negotiations in the future, and those negotiations haven't really happened. So the Trump administration has signaled that it's going to not verify that Iran is adhering to the agreement in the next review. And that's going to bring up a bunch of questions about, okay, well, does the nuclear deal collapse? What do the negotiations look like? What is the Trump administration going to ask for? Will the Iranians be willing to give it, etc.? So the issue is quiet right now, but basically that's just because the Trump administration is saving the big news for later. It's going to be in the news a lot once that review comes up in a couple of months, but it's definitely still at play, so to speak. As for my thoughts on it, you know, I mean, there's reason for criticism. There's definitely some issues there. There's not really any guarantee that the Iranian government is adhering to it. Nominally, there are provisions in the agreement that require certification and verification, but they're not so airtight that the Iranians couldn't get around them if they wanted to. And more to the point, the agreement does not cover ballistic missile development. And of course, one of the things you're concerned about as far as nuclear proliferation is not only nuclear weapons development, but also the development of the capacity to use nuclear weapons on targets that are far away. So North Korea, for example, has nuclear weapons, but it cannot yet, as far as we know, put them into a ballistic missile, which means that it can't attack the United States yet. It can't launch a ballistic missile with the nuclear warhead and hit the US. They don't have that technology yet. But if you have a country that is developing a nuclear weapon, if they're developing a ballistic missile at the same time, it's not hard to guess why. You can assume that it would be reasonable to infer that the ballistic missile development is being done so that they can put a nuclear warhead on it at some point and hit targets far away and use that as a deterrent against countries that are threatening them but who are located very far away, like, say, the United States. So the nuclear agreement does not cover ballistic missile development, and the Trump administration would like to have that covered. And a lot of people critical of the agreement have brought that up before. There's also a desire to tie broader regional politics in. There's a desire to require the Iranian government to cut down on its foreign adventurism in the region, in Syria, Iraq, etc., in exchange for an American adherence to a nuclear deal that involves relaxing sanctions. And then another problem was, let me see if I can remember it. Right, the sunset. There was a sunset provision in the deal that said that all of the requirements for Iran to restrict its production will end basically within 10 years. Or maybe it was 20 years. I think it was 2020, so within 10 years. And the idea there was basically, that was kind of a concession given to Iran. The Iranians did not want to agree to perpetually freeze their nuclear program. And so what brought them to the table, what brought them into agreement was basically a concession that said, okay, we'll only require you to stop the nuclear program development for 10 years. And after that, we can renegotiate. There was a lot of people who were very critical of that because they thought, okay, they can secretly keep developing nukes, and then after the 10-year sunset is reached, they can make a sprint, so to speak. They can use what development they've made secretly in the 10 years and then have a big push very quickly to nuclear weapons, and then they would have them and you wouldn't be able to do much about it. That's the fear, anyway, on the part of skeptics. So the Trump administration would like to have a agreement in perpetuity, basically a perpetual agreement where they freeze their program. Also, speaking of freezing the program, another one of the criticisms of the plan is that it only requires Iran to freeze their nuclear development and cut back on it slightly. It doesn't require them to get rid of it. Iran has no obligation as part of the deal to completely get rid of its nuclear development program over the course of the next 10 years or after. So hypothetically, whatever gains they've made thus far before the agreement, they can just freeze in place and then pick up where they left off after the sunset is reached. So that was another big criticism of the deal. You're not actually solving the problem, you're more just delaying it. So there's certainly grounds for some criticism there. Those in favor of the agreement argued that it was better than war. Certainly Iran could retaliate pretty strongly against airstrikes against its nuclear facilities with any number of actions around the Middle East. You know, they're involved in a lot of conflicts there, and so they're in a position to cause a lot of trouble. An invasion of Iran is not really on the table. The United States could barely handle occupying Iraq. I have no idea how they would handle occupying Iran. I don't really think it's feasible. And even a lot of people in Iran who are against the Iranian regime, who want reform and don't like the theocratic regime in Iran right now, even those people would be very opposed to an American invasion. It's not like Americans would be met with roses and flowers in the street or anything. There would be a lot of opposition and the nationalist backlash. So conflict comes with a lot of problems. You know, it's kind of similar to North Korea in that way, only worse because Iran has a lot more power in its region generally than North Korea does. North Korea is much more isolated than Iran is. But yeah, there's a lot of costs associated with conflict, and the people for the deal say that it's better than those. You know, whatever problems the deal has, it was still worth it because it was better than the alternatives. And they say that a better deal in the future can be negotiated, and that circumstances in the 10 years set out in the agreement, in that 10 years, circumstances could change that a better agreement could be negotiated in the future. So yes, it is they admit that it's kicking the can down the road, but they would argue that it's kicking the can down the road so that perhaps something better could be done later. So make of it what you will, basically. Everyone can kind of, it's up to your own politics as to what you think about it. You know, I'm not going to tell you what to think about it or what to believe, but that's basically the breakdown of the agreement. Let's see. Oh God.
There's a ton. I don't know. I haven't checked how far along you are, but you know, 1,000 people. If you do the math, if even a few of them are asking questions, we're gonna get a load of them.
Yeah, so. And the next one's about gun control.
Yeah. Well, we can tackle some of these next time if we're short. We could kind of
we'll blow up chat with the gun control next time.
Yeah, people love that.
Yeah, we talked about it, I think a month or two ago, and chat just melted down.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a little bit unfortunate sometimes if you get one of those hot topics started, then there will be like 4 people who just talk about it for the rest of the time.
Yeah.
Sometimes it can be fruitful, I guess.
Yeah, it's interesting. I learned a bit. I learned some things I didn't know reading through chat.
Yeah. Well, great having you back, dude.
Yeah, thanks for having me back. It's been fun.
Cool. So probably next Sunday I'll let you know if we have any exceptions about it. But thanks.
Oh, no problem. Yeah, opportunity knocks. You got to take advantage.
Yep. Thanks for sharing your knowledge. We appreciate you.
Could I plug my Twitter real quick?
Heck yes, you can.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess that's it. I'm on Twitter, so I generally I don't do much on it. I just post articles that I think are interesting and say something about politics or economics or what have you, policy, things like that. So if you're interested in these kinds of discussions, you might like the Twitter feed where you can see kind of basically a lot more stuff like this.
Yep. I usually put that on the VOD for it on YouTube. And it's in the command too when people are like, is Neuro listening to a podcast? What is this? The who is it command. We got your Twitter and your SoundCloud in there.
Cool. Thank you very much.
Yeah. The audio was much better this time, though. There were no issues. Sometimes you would go a little bit robotic in the previous sessions.
I wish I knew why.
Yeah.
I would do it more, whatever it is.
Sweet, dude. Well, take care of yourself, and we'll see you on the next time.
Yep. See you next time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Fuzzy Cord, for handing along the questions. I thoroughly appreciate you, especially with this swarm of amazing viewers we have. I think overall, for having 1,000, the chat has been good. We've had some days with like 300, 400 viewers that have been relatively way worse. Uh-oh. And just as I say that, someone has to get timed out. I jinxed it. That was my fault. My bad. Thank you, Sea of Whiskey, for maintaining order. Order! I need a court. I need a not like a basketball court. I need like a court of law scene. I feel like that would be super helpful, especially with these disputes of is this acceptable, is that acceptable. I would echo one of Sea of Whiskey's fun little sayings. If you're thinking about saying something on Twitch, ask yourself, if I were to say this in one of the rough bars in town, would I get punched in the face? If yes, you probably should not say that. It's not a perfect rule, but it's a good guideline that would give people some sense of what is acceptable and what is not. Change Mod Swords to Gap.